The committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, we are holding a hearing on H.R. 1, the For the People Act. H.R. 1, introduced by my distinguished colleague, Congressman John Sarbanes of Maryland, a senior member of our committee. And we thank Congressman Sarbanes for his, not only for his vision, but for his tenacity and for putting his blood, his sweat, his tears into this over several years. He has compiled one of the boldest reform packages to be considered in the history of this body. This sweeping legislation will clean up corruption in government, fight secret money in politics, and make it easier for American citizens across this great country to vote. I believe that we should be doing everything in our power to make it easier for eligible American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote, not making it harder. We should be making it more convenient, not less. We should be encouraging more people to cast their votes, not fewer. We should be promoting early voting, absentee voting, voting by mail, and other ways to help citizens cast their ballots, not rolling back these very important programs. Unfortunately, some people disagree, including most Republicans. They think we should make it harder to vote. They think we should make it more difficult by cutting back on early voting, eliminating polling places, and taking other steps to reduce the number of people who do vote. Especially troubling in some cases, they have engaged in illegal efforts to suppress the vote that target minority communities. For example, North Carolina drew legislative lines, and the Fourth District Circuit Court of Appeals found that as to African Americans, and I quote, the lines were drawn with almost surgical precision, that is to suppress the vote. Georgia kept eligible individuals off the rolls and caused widespread problems with wait times and absentee ballots, particularly in areas with significant minority populations. Kansas moved to the outskirts of town, the one and only polling place for 27,000 residents of Dodge City, most of whom were minorities. There's something wrong with that picture. H.R. 1 would address many of these problems. The bill would institute procedures to automatically register eligible voters and put in place protections to keep them on the correct voting rolls. It would provide for expanded early voting and absentee voting and give additional funding to states to maintain enough polling sites so everyone can easily cast their ballot. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has described H.R. 1 as, and I quote, a power grab by Democrats. He's right about one thing. It is a power grab, but it is not by Democrats. It is by American citizens who voted for reform in this last election and sent a clear message that they want to exercise their constitutional right to vote without interference. Today, our hearing will focus on the part of H.R. 1 that is within our jurisdiction, Title 8, which puts in place strong new reforms for the executive branch. For example, Title 8 includes a bill that I introduced called the Executive Branch Ethics Reform Act. It would ban senior officials from accepting, quote, golden parachute, unquote, payments from private sector employers in exchange for their government service. This would have prevented Gary Cohn from receiving more than $100 million in accelerated payments from Goldman Sachs while leading the Trump administration's efforts to slash corporate taxes. Title VIII also includes another bill I introduced, the Transition Team Ethics Improvement Act, with Senator Carper and Senator Warren. This legislation would require transition teams to have ethics plans in place and make those plans publicly available. Title VIII also would prohibit senior federal employees from working on matters that affect the financial interests of their former employers or prospective employers. They could obtain waivers for this requirement, but those waivers would have to be made public. Title VIII also would make clear that Congress expects the President to divest his business holdings, just as every single president since Jimmy Carter has done, and place them in an independent and truly blind trust. Both Democratic and Republican ethics experts warned President Trump to do this years ago, but he refused. They warned that every decision he made could be questioned, and the American people would rightly wonder whether he was serving the nation's interests or his own financial interests. Unfortunately, that is exactly what has happened over the past few years. The American people gave this Congress and this committee a mandate to restore our democracy and clean up our government. They want greater transparency. They want greater accountability in government. H.R. 1 makes good on that promise. It is a broad and brave step towards restoring a government that works for the people. Now it gives me great honor to recognize the author of the bill for 2 minutes, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your having this hearing on H.R. 1. I also want to salute some of the new members on the dais here because they came with this message of reform pinned to their chest as a class. Americans from across the political spectrum want a democracy that works for them, a democracy where big money doesn't dominate the political debate, where access to the ballot box is ensured for all citizens, and where public servants work for the public interest. Like any system, our republic requires regular maintenance. Without it, the gears grind down, the operating systems fail, and the people's democratic will is ultimately compromised. This is what's happened to our democratic institutions over the past few decades. We have failed to beat back the new and inventive ways that big money has found to corrupt our politics. We have failed to modernize our election system, and we have failed to implement meaningful ethics rules. No wonder the public's faith in elected representatives is flagging, why confidence in our democratic institutions is near historic lows, and why cynicism is so high. H.R. 1, the For the People Act, is about giving Americans their republic back, unrigging the rules of American democracy by fighting back against big money in politics, ensuring all Americans can vote, and ending partisan gerrymandering and enacting tough new anti-corruption measures. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, will be an opportunity to examine the imperative for and the design of anti-corruption measures that are included in H.R. 1, and I very much look forward to that discussion. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1 will give Americans their power back in our democracy, the power of the ballot box, the power of political voice, and the power of accountable representative democracy. Put plainly, these reforms are not partisan, they're patriotic. We can and must do better to work together to repair our democratic institutions. Many of the provisions in here actually incorporate bills that have had bipartisan support in years past. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the dais will join us in the effort to strengthen our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I yield to the distinguished member, Mr. Lynch. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My legislation that is incorporated in this bill, my bill H.R. 391, is the White House Ethics Transparency Act, which would simply require the Trump administration and future administrations to automatically disclose ethics waivers that they've issued to executive branch officials. These waivers allow former lobbyists, industry attorneys, and consultants who previously worked for the private sector and present a significant conflict of interest with their positions in the executive branch to nevertheless participate in matters in which their prior employers or clients have a stake. And pursuant to the bill, disclosures must be submitted to the Independent Officer of Government Ethics within 30 days and be publicly posted on the White House and OGE websites. Mr. Schwab is well aware of this. One of our witnesses, early on we had the White House just refused to say whether and when they had given waivers to various lobbyists to go to work in his administration. So the inclusion of this section of the bill will prevent that from happening in the future. So with that, I yield back, and I thank you for your time.
I yield the final 2 minutes to Mr. Raskin of Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. With your leadership, with a robust new majority in the House of Representatives, it's a new day in Washington. A great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, spoke of government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that's always been the tantalizing dream of America. It's our role as Congress to guarantee that we are a government of the people. But today, the executive branch is drowning in big money corruption, self-dealing, and lawlessness. They said they were going to drain the swamp, Mr. Chairman. They moved into the swamp, they built a hotel on it, and they started renting out rooms to foreign princes and kings and governments. It is our job to restore government by the people in America, which is why I'm thrilled to introduce the Executive Branch Comprehensive Ethics Enforcement Act with Senator Blumenthal on the Senate side. It will give subpoena power to the Office of Government Ethics. It will allow formal proceedings to take place there. It makes clear that it extends to all White House personnel as well as the executive branch agencies. It authorizes the Office of Government Ethics to order corrective actions like divestiture, blind trusts, and recusal, and impose appropriate administrative penalties where members of the executive branch are trampling our laws. It protects the independence of the Office of Government Ethics by providing that the director can be removed only for cause. So it strengthens the independence of the Office of Government Ethics to make sure that we can ferret out the corruption which is now pervasive throughout the executive branch of government in the Trump administration. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now yield to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, the ranking member of our full committee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses as well for being here. Normally, when you start a new Congress, the majority gives the designation of H.R. 1 to its key priority. In the last Congress, H.R. 1 was the most significant tax reform, tax cut package in a generation, returned millions of dollars to Americans, simplified our tax code, and was one of the key reasons I think we've seen 5 million new jobs added to our economy in the last couple of years. That bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was bold, realistic, and it was signed into law just over a year ago. I think it's also helped create the lowest unemployment in 50 years, an economy that is moving in exactly the direction we want. This Congress, the Democrats' H.R. 1 is the so-called For the People Act. A more accurate title would be For the People Who Want Democrats to Win Elections from now on. The bill includes a laundry list of tired proposals designed to benefit the majority by tilting the playing field in their favor. It's not a stretch to label many of these proposals radical. You can laugh, but it's true. H.R. 1 would steer potentially billions of dollars to political allies in the name of campaign finance empowerment, restrict Americans' right to free speech, and exact political retribution on the President of the United States. Unfortunately, this isn't all that surprising. This is just the latest in a series of attacks by the Democrats to stifle the free exchange of ideas. 2013, we learned that the IRS targeted conservatives for their political beliefs during the 2012 election cycle. Systematically, for a sustained period of time, they went after people for their conservative beliefs. Plan in place, targeted people, they did it. The gross abuse of power would have continued if not for the efforts of this committee. 2014, the Obama administration doubled down and attempted to use the IRS rulemaking process to gut the ability of social welfare organizations to participate in public debate. Congress has so far prevented this regulation from going into effect, but H.R. 1 would change that. Furthermore, this bill would roll back another critical victory for privacy and free speech secured just last summer. Following efforts by this committee and others, the IRS changed its policy as it relates to Schedule B information. Schedule B contains personal information like names, addresses, and the amounts donated to nonprofit entities. Even though this information is supposed to remain private, under current law, states and federal government have leaked these personal details in the past. In changing its policy, the IRS noted that there had been at least 14 breaches resulting in the unauthorized disclosure of Schedule B information just since 2010. The result was everyday Americans receiving death threats and mail containing white powder, all because someone disagreed with what they believe and who they gave their hard-earned money to. The reason that the protection of Schedule B information is important has nothing to do with the vast conspiracies on the right or the left, this so-called dark money issue. Rather, it dates back to the Supreme Court's 1958 decision, critical decision, the NAACP versus Alabama, which formally recognized the freedom of association and prevented the NAACP from being compelled to turn over information about its members. Look, I haven't even got to all the other problems with this bill. I mean, this bill, mandatory early vote, I mean, talk about violation of the 10th Amendment in our federal systems, mandatory early voting, mandatory voting by mail, felons can vote. How about public financing of campaigns? The taxpayers have to pay for the politicians' campaigns. Think about this. Taxpayers have to pay for the same politicians who created the swamp, who were in the swamp, so that they can get reelected. I mean, this is what this legislation does. There's much that can be done to improve the functioning of transparency and effectiveness of the federal government. However, this 571-page bill reads more like a wish list for the Democratic Party than an honest attempt at reform. I fear that this legislation is a sign our friends in the majority want to play games, engage in political theater to start this Congress, rather than use this time to work constructively to find solutions for hardworking Americans that sent us here. Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield, I think we have a few more minutes left. I want to first yield to the gentleman, if I could, from Tennessee, Mr. Green, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I'm outraged at House Resolution 1, which should really be called Fill the Swamp Act. It seems every year that passes, more and more power is shifted away from the people and into the hands of wealthy elites in Washington. These politicians and bureaucrats can't help themselves from micromanaging more and more of our everyday lives, from roads and bridges, firearms, relationships with our doctors, even our toilets. These freedom and federalism-hating politicians can't seem to help themselves. And now they want to decide how we can run our elections in Tennessee. You want to tell Tennessee to enact same-day voter registration with no time for verification? You want to tell Tennessee we can't require IDs to be shown at the polls, increasing the likelihood of voter fraud? You want to tell Tennessee that some unaccountable commission gets to draw our districts? You want to tell Tennessee it has to subsidize far left-leaning candidates in other states with our taxpayer dollars? How dare you? How dare you tell Tennessee what we can do with our elections? This bill is wrong. It is a power grab. Politicians that want to give the federal government more power. Does the majority party care about voter fraud? Well, then let's allow states to have voter identification laws. Do the Democrats suddenly care about foreign interference in our elections? Well, then why are they allowing illegal immigrants to vote? The hypocrisy is mind-boggling. The fact remains that there is no constitutional authority for the federal government to come down and seize control of elections in Tennessee. The Constitution creates a federalist system with power dispersed amongst the people, and I will fight to ensure it always does. I will keep my oath to uphold the Constitution and my promise to Tennesseans to drain the swamp. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas for 2 minutes.
Thank you to the distinguished ranking member. I'd like to co-sponsor the remarks from my friend from Tennessee. I wholeheartedly endorse all that he just said, as well as what Mr. Jordan just said. One question that I'd be asking as we look into all of this is, why are we so divided? Why are we so divided as a nation? I would suggest to you in significant part is because we try to govern from Washington 320, 330 million people with solutions here from the swamp in direct contradiction to the very republic our founders gave us, looking ahead at knowing what it would look like if we tried to do that. We are a republic. We are a republic for a reason. We have a structure of government for a reason. That structure of government serves to preserve our inalienable God-given rights. That structure of government has served well to do those things. And that structure of government recognizes the importance of states in the decision-making process across the vast majority of the issues we're supposed to deal with. When we take our eye off the ball of our core constitutional function, we don't do those functions well. We end up with a $1 trillion deficit this year, piling on top of $22 trillion of national debt. And yes, both parties are a part of that problem. We end up immersed in foreign wars that continue, as the president pointed out last night. We end up with spiraling health care costs because the president immersed us into health care from Washington instead of allowing the people and markets and states to function. And now we want to extend into every aspect of every issue of voting, issues that are supposed to be left to the states, so that the people in the states can decide who they want to send to Washington, whether they're senators or whether they're in the Congress. We would undermine the very structure and the core of this government further if we pursue this path down H.R. 1. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, for our remaining 2 minutes, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia.
I thank the ranking member, and I join with my colleagues in just being extremely alarmed by H.R. 1, and it's virtually 600 pages. Almost every page has issues of great concern. Just one small part of that, the chairman mentioned a while ago, the automatic voter registration. It forces states to automatically register people, which may sound good on the surface, but what this will do is open the floodgates for fraudulent voting by illegal individuals in this country. And here's how. Here's what happens. These illegals who come into this country use government services and programs, and under H.R. 1, the information collected by these services and programs would automatically be transferred to election officials for registration. And there's only one safeguard in H.R. 1, and that is for the illegal alien to publicly declare that they're here illegally and they're not eligible to vote. How can we really expect that to happen? It's not going to happen for them to draw attention to themselves and identify themselves as being here illegally and therefore ineligible to vote. So simultaneously, when an illegal alien fails to decline, fails to recognize that they're here illegally and they're ineligible to vote, despite the ineligibility, they cannot be prosecuted. So this bill is just going to make it extremely difficult to maintain accurate voting records. It's going to open the floodgate for fraud. And so what we basically have here is a proposal that will lead to more illegal aliens registering to vote, making it virtually impossible to prosecute them for doing so, and making it difficult for states to clean up their voter lists. In process, what that does to the American citizen, the voter, it waters down the power of their vote by allowing illegals to do so. It makes those who are eligible, their vote to have less impact. So I'm very concerned. I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our members for your statements. And now all members will have 10 legislative days in which to submit opening statements for the record. Ladies and gentlemen, today we welcome 5 distinguished witnesses to our committee. Mr. Walter Schwab is the former director of the Office of Government Ethics and now serves as a senior advisor to Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Mrs. Karen Hobert Flynn is the president of Common Cause, a nonpartisan grassroots organization dedicated to upholding the core values of American democracy. Mr. Rudy Merbani is the former director of the Office of Presidential Personnel and now serves as a senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. Mr. Scott Amey is the general counsel for the Project on Government Oversight. And finally, Mr. Bradley Smith is the chairman of the Institute for Free Speech. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses who appear before our committee must do so under oath. I now ask each of you to stand and raise your right hand to take the oath. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Everybody has now answered yes, and let the record reflect that. I will now recognize each witness to present their testimony. I want to remind the witnesses that we have your written testimony before us, so you don't have to read it all. We have it. And I ask you to do me a favor, since we have 5 witnesses and we have a lot of members wanting to ask questions, that you obey the lights. You'll get a warning light. And then when it says red, I would appreciate it if you would that you would stop and let us move on to the next witness. So we're going to go with Mr. Rob first. Mr. Amey. Mr. Amey, please.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and the committee for asking the Project on Government Oversight, POGO, to testify about executive branch ethics. I am Scott Amey, POGO's General Counsel. POGO is a nonpartisan, independent watchdog that investigates and exposes waste, corruption, and abuse of power. H.R. 1, which POGO supports, is an opportunity to make good on the bipartisan work that this committee has performed and to reform the ethics system to meet old and emerging challenges. We support stronger laws to slow the revolving door, improve the Office of Government Ethics, expand ethics restrictions to senior-level officials. Title 8 in H.R. 1 is a step forward in improving consistency in enforcement, but more importantly, to reduce improper influence over government decisions, missions, programs, and spending that are often contrary to the public's interests. Groups at this table have assembled for over a decade to correct problems created by the revolving door and cozy relationships that result in an unlevel playing field. POGO published reports on the revolving door in 2004, 2005, and one just last year. The 2018 report showed that lobbying was the occupation of choice when officials left government service, a job that relies less on management skills and more on your connections back inside of the government. Despite the focus on the revolving door coming and going from the Department of Defense, the problems exist government-wide and concerns exist about having a personal or private interest, being lenient toward or favoring past or future employers, and gaining an unfair competitive advantage, all of which are the detriment to the public. H.R. 1 would close the gaps in ethics and conflict of interest standards, especially the provisions in Title 8. POGO particularly supports the provisions in Title 8 related to making the government or the Office of Government Ethics more independent, slowing program and procurement officials from heading to companies they worked with or oversaw while in government service, codifying the presidential ethics pledges that have come out since 1993, prohibiting a bonus for accepting government position. This really came to light during the Obama administration when Wall Street executives revolved into the government, expanding cooling off periods when coming and leaving the government, and increasing transparency. With the limited time, I will briefly highlight the top 3. First, the Office of Government Ethics should become an independent agency with new authorities to ensure consistent enforcement of ethics laws government-wide. H.R. 1 would provide the OGE director, when appropriate, approval over resolutions and any recusals, exemptions, or waivers from ethics rules, increase transparency, give OGE improved investigative power, and grant OGE the authority to issue administrative and legal remedies when the ethics violation is found. We support the provisions to add for-cause removal for the OGE director. For-cause removal will preserve the agency's independence and help with continuity after turnovers in between administrations. We've heard stories of pressure coming from the top on the Office of Government Ethics as well as agency ethics officials, and that must end. Second, amending the Procurement Integrity Act is essential. We need to strike the provision in the law allowing former program and procurement officials to work for companies they contracted with or oversaw, so long as they go to a different part of the company. We can't risk allowing officials to leverage their relationship with the company for future employment, calling into question the decisions that they made while they were in government. Additionally, those officials should not be allowed to access their former colleagues, which can create an unfair competitive advantage. Darlene Druyan, a senior Air Force acquisition official, left the government and took a position with Boeing's missile division. Prior to leaving government service, she played a role in the award of a $20 billion contract to Boeing for refueling tankers, and in her plea agreement, she stated that she agreed to a higher price even though she believed it was not appropriate as a parting gift to Boeing. Her cozy relationship also included helping her daughter keep a job with the Boeing company. The existing laws allowed Darlene Druyan to accept a job with Boeing. Druyan eventually pled guilty to a separate ethics violation and served 9 months in prison. These violations were not exposed by ethics officials or IGs. It was Senator McCain who found them while investigating the tanker deal, and he became concerned with the blatant revolving door concerns. Third, H.R. 1 will codify the ethics pledge process that has been ordered by President since 1993. POGO supports making the pledge law, because otherwise ethics orders exist only at the whim of each president. Making the pledge law would add continuity within the ethics community and prevent the pledge from being revoked on the president's last day in office, as was the case with President Clinton. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued an executive order stating in part, "Every citizen is entitled to complete confidence in the integrity of his or her government." President Johnson's order is a foundation for our ethics system today. Our support for Title VIII of H.R. 1 and the improvements that I have detailed for you today are both realistic and necessary to prevent conflicts of interest. H.R. 1 is a step forward in reducing improper influence over our government and the bad deals that harm the public. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I look forward to answering the questions from the members of the committee and working with the entire committee to further explore how federal ethics and conflict of interest systems can be improved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hobert.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee for holding this critically important hearing. I'd also like to thank Congressman Sarbanes for his leadership championing the For the People Act as the type of bold, innovative package of solutions that can restore people's trust in our government. One final note of thanks to House Speaker Pelosi for her commitment to making this the first order of business in the new Congress. My name is Karen Hobert Flynn, and I'm president of Common Cause, a national nonpartisan watchdog organization with 1.2 million supporters. For nearly 50 years, we've been working to strengthen the people's voice in their democracy. I'm here to testify in support of For the People Act. First, I want to say that Americans have not been waiting for Washington to fix what ails them in our democracy. We've been working at the state and local level with many other groups to pass significant pro-democracy reforms. This is the second consecutive election cycle where voters have passed 95% of the democracy reforms on the ballot. In 2018, voters in 20 red, blue, and purple states and localities have passed democracy reforms with strong support from Republicans, independent, and Democratic voters. This includes voting rights restoration in Florida, same-day voter registration in Maryland. It includes independent redistricting commissions in Colorado, Michigan, and redistricting reform in Utah, automatic voter registration in Nevada and Michigan, an independent ethics commission in New Mexico, and an anti-corruption package in Missouri. I should note that also these kinds of reforms and many embodied in H.R. 1, campaign finance disclosure, ethics reforms, and others also pass with bipartisan support in state legislatures. The reforms embodied in H.R. 1 are not lofty, untested ideas. Most are pragmatic solutions that are already working in a city or state somewhere in this country. These solutions are proven to work and in many cases save taxpayers money. The timing of this legislation has never been more important as Americans grow more frustrated and cynical about our state of politics. While every presidential administration in our nation's history has had various ethical challenges, we've never seen so many corruption scandals and appalling lack of concern for the ethic rules that should govern our executive branch than with this administration. We have a series of reports that detail dozens and dozens of ethical challenges and conflicts of interest that have plagued this administration in the last 2 years. The American people want transparency, honesty, and accountability from its elected representatives. They do not want their elected leaders to use their public office for private gain, to enrich their businesses, their wealthy donors, their family, or themselves. We believe tough ethics laws like the ones that we're talking about here today, with a strengthened Office of Government Ethics that has independent oversight and investigative and enforcement tools, can help us prevent the incessant assault on our democratic values and institutions of self-government. My written testimony outlines our support for all of the measures before the committee today, and I'll just add 2 more comments. One is, I agree with Chairman Cummings that on Election Day, we should make Election Day a holiday. We have found, as we do election protection, nonpartisan election protection across the country, that with aging infrastructure and machines malfunctioning, and a lack of poll workers, that people have long lines up to 4 hours. Many working Americans can't afford to take 4 hours off of their day in order to vote. So making it a holiday would make a huge difference. In addition, we strongly support the Conflicts from Political Fundraising Act because Americans deserve to know whether people nominated to serve in the executive branch have raised money or benefited from special interest money from the industries they are supposed to regulate. There are currently no requirements for presidential appointees to disclose whether they've solicited funds or contributed funds for political purposes to PACs, super PACs, 501c4s, or 501c6 business associations, and it's a significant gap that we think should be closed. We don't work on these issues just to look good. We pass reforms so that the government can be more responsive to the needs of everyday Americans. You will hear some who benefit from the current system use tired arguments that defend the current system, saying it works fine. The American people do not believe that our current system is just fine. You will also hear people talking about the First Amendment to justify billionaires, corporations, and special interests spending millions of dollars in politics while our children, our families, our schools and communities, and our environment all suffer. Polls show that people want bold ethics and transparency reforms, and they want to clean up our system and give people more voice in our democracy. We look forward to working with this committee. We believe that this is a strong package. There are always elements that can be strengthened, and we look forward to the questions ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barabani.
I would like to thank Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and the entire committee for the opportunity to testify today in support of House Resolution 1, the For the People Act. The Brennan Center enthusiastically supports H.R. 1. It would be historic legislation. It addresses longstanding problems with our system of self-government, long lines, vast sums of money, of dark money, harmful rules and practices that make it harder for many, especially voters of color, to cast their ballot, the ongoing challenges of gerrymandering, inadequate election administration, and at-risk technology. It addresses these issues with groundbreaking reforms that are proven to work: automatic voter registration, small donor matching, the Voting Rights Act, redistricting commissions, early voting, election security, and more. It is thus fitting that this bill is the very first introduced in this Congress. Today, I will focus on Title 8 of the Act, ethics reform for the President, Vice President, and federal officers and employees. The reforms respond to the erosion of ethical guardrails in government that we have seen over a number of years. They are a strong first step to restoring public faith in accountable and ethical government. We have long assumed that all presidential administrations would follow long-standing ethics practices and ideals that aren't required by law. For example, following precedent established by their predecessors over the last 40-odd years to publicly release their tax returns, voluntarily comply with conflicts of interest law that apply to other executive branch employees by divesting from potentially conflicting assets or keeping their assets in a qualified blind trust, strive to avoid the appearance of improper or undue influence of outside interests in the way their administrations formulated official policy, or strive to fully enforce existing ethics laws. Unfortunately, these common sense practices that presidents from both parties followed for decades can no longer be taken for granted. This means that new laws are needed to compel a commitment to ethics and ensure accountability. As I detail in my written testimony, when presidents and agency heads do not lead on ethics issues, they can result in serious ethical lapses. The improper use of government positions, running afoul of other laws like appropriations laws, and violations of revolving door prohibitions. This results in an incredible waste of taxpayer resources, and it seriously harms public trust and faith in government. From my experience in government, presidential leadership on ethics issues filters down throughout an administration. When I ran the Presidential Personnel Office, we followed certain practices not just because of my office's commitment, but because President Obama demanded that we have an ethical personnel process. That meant we worked collaboratively with the Office of Government Ethics and strengthened post-employment lobbying restrictions, even if that wasn't technically required by law. Some have said that more robust ethics rules would deter talented individuals from serving in government. But many of the reforms in H.R. 1 have long been voluntarily followed by administrations. And some administrations, like the one that I served in, went further and supplemented those rules. What was the result? A historic number of Americans expressing interest to serve in an administration, arguably the most diverse administration in history, and appointees who, on average, served in their positions substantially longer than their predecessors. Strong ethics laws, in short, help recruitment. A recent poll showed only a third of Americans trust government to do what is right, a decline of 14% from 2017. More than 3/4 of voters ranked corruption in government as a top issue in the 2018 election, with almost a third calling it the most important issue. At the same time, we know Americans are yearning for solutions to these problems and real action on those solutions. This Congress was elected with the highest voter turnout in a midterm since 1914. Many of you were elected with a pledge to reform democracy. And in states across the country, major ballot measures were passed by large bipartisan margins to implement bold and creative reform. Voters spoke clearly. The best way to respond to attacks on democracy is to strengthen it, which is exactly what H.R. 1 does. We urge you to pass it. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Schwab.
Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to talk about the ethics reforms in H.R. 1. I served in the Office of Government Ethics as director, and before that as a career ethics official. In my 14 years there, I've been intimately involved in protecting the principle that public service is a public trust. Based on this experience, I know how urgently we need reform, and that's why I support H.R. 1. The executive branch ethics program focuses on prevention. OGE has no real enforcement authority. In theory, OGE can order officials to cease ongoing violations, but statutory limitations prevent any effective use of this authority. OGE can ask agencies to conduct investigations and can request copies of records, but it has no power to do anything if they ignore these requests. Lacking enforcement tools, OGE relies on the director's ability to persuade or shame officials into doing the right thing. This was never ideal, but it worked fairly well for 4 decades. During my time in government, Presidents Bush and Obama were reliable supporters of OGE. They showed that government ethics is not a partisan issue. We now find ourselves in an ethics crisis. The trigger was President Trump's refusal to divest his conflicting financial interests. This radical departure from ethical norms leaves the public with no way of knowing how personal interests are affecting public policy. What we do know only raises questions. For example, questions surround President Trump's response when individuals associated with the Saudi government murdered a Washington Post journalist, a resident of my home state. We can only wonder if President Trump's financial interests influenced the handling of sanctions on certain Russian businesses. Did they affect his decision to help Chinese telecom giant ZTE? Why did the administration scrap the plan to move FBI's headquarters? Was it because President Trump didn't want a competitor moving in so close to his D.C. hotel? These are just a few examples. And the president's disinterest in ethics has infected his appointees. The heads of 6 agencies have stepped down under a cloud of ethics issues. At least 7 other appointees resigned under the taint of an investigation, ethics issues, or security clearance concerns. The Office of Special Counsel has found that 9 of his appointees violated the Hatch Act, and there are dozens of pending ethics-related investigations. H.R. 1 kicks off what I hope will be a wave of reform. It focuses not just on the current crisis, but also issues that predate this administration. For example, H.R. 1 addresses big payouts to incoming officials. These golden parachutes raise concerns about an appointee's loyalty to a former employer. When former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew left Wall Street to join the State Department, he received a large bonus. His employment agreement let him keep that bonus specifically because he landed a high-level government job. I'm glad to see a provision in H.R. 1 addressing this issue, and my written testimony offers a suggestion for strengthening it further. H.R. 1 would also make OGE more independent. Like the heads of MSPB and OSC, OGE's director would be allowed to communicate directly with Congress and would be removable only for cause. Rather than depending on other agencies, OGE would be able to conduct meaningful inquiries by issuing subpoenas. H.R. 1 would increase the transparency of waivers, which can undermine the ethics program if granted improperly. The public needs to know about waivers. Before leaving OGE, I exposed questionable practices involving the issuance of undated, unsigned, and retroactive waivers, some of which seem designed to paper over ethics violations. I'll close by emphasizing that what's at stake is the very integrity of government. The Supreme Court has warned that a conflict of interest is an evil that endangers the very fabric of a democratic society. The court explained that democracy is effective only if people have faith in those who govern. We need ethics reform before the public's trust in government is shattered beyond repair. I urge you to pass H.R. 1. Thank you again for inviting me, and I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have today.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings and Mr. Jordan, members of the committee. The Institute for Free Speech has been producing detailed analyses of the many sections of, as the chairman called it, a sweeping bill, 570 pages. Some of those are available here today. I'm going to focus very briefly on 2 aspects of this bill with which I have particular expertise as former chairman of the Federal Election Commission and as the author of the leading academic analysis of super PAC and coordinated spending and the author of many of the FEC's current coordination rules. Since its inception, the Federal Election Commission has been a bipartisan agency. This was at the insistence of people such as Democratic Representative Wayne Hayes and Democratic Senator Alan Cranston, who warned we must not allow the FEC to become a tool for harassment by future imperial presidents who may seek to repeat the abuses of Watergate. Subtitle A of Title VI of H.R. 1 would replace the current 6-member bipartisan FEC with a 5-member panel subject to partisan control. In theory, only 2 members could come from any one party, requiring a 5th seat to be held by an independent, but this is a fig leaf. In fact, the FEC has an independent now, but it's understood that Commissioner Stephen Walther was appointed at the behest of former Democratic Senate leader Harry Reid, whom Mr. Walther had represented in election matters, and it's understood that he holds a Democratic seat. Under H.R. 1, Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, a frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2020, could be appointed as a, quote, independent. Any president could find a nominal independent to reflect his party's views, creating a partisan majority on the commission. Further, H.R. 1 gives vast new powers to the FEC chairman, justifying fully the title of speech czar. The chair would have the sole power to determine the agency budget, to subpoena witnesses, to compel testimony and reports, and to appoint the staff director, who oversees, among other things, the FEC's audit division. This is a prescription for partisan control and abuse. I assume the majority knows that, and that is why this provision of the bill, unlike the others, does not take effect until 2021. The majority has no intention of allowing President Trump to appoint all 5 commissioners, including the powerful chair. Now, the claim is made that a partisan-controlled commission is necessary to restore integrity to election enforcement. This has it exactly backwards. The only reason that the FEC has any credibility is its bipartisan makeup. Under Title VI, the person elected in 2020 will appoint all 5 members of the commission, including the powerful chair, which will have the power to write and then rewrite new rules with an eye toward the 2022 midterms, the 2024 and 2028 presidential elections. Now, some of you may consider this a feature rather than a bug, but be careful what you wish for. You didn't think Trump would win in 2016 either. Subtitle B of Title VI is called Stopping Super PAC Candidate Coordination. The sponsors and drafters are either being intentionally disingenuous here or they simply do not understand what has been put into their own legislation. Nothing in Subtitle B, nothing, limits its reach to super PACs. It applies to every union, trade association, advocacy group, and unincorporated association in the country. It applies to Planned Parenthood and Right to Life, to the NAACP and the ACLU, to the National Federation of Independent Business, and to the Brady Campaign for Gun Safety. It even applies to individual citizens who seek to participate in public discussion. Nothing, this cannot be said often enough, limits it to super PACs. Through the interplay of its definitions of coordination and coordinated spenders, the law's traditional treatment of coordinated spending as a contribution to a candidate and current contribution limits in the law, Subtitle B will actually have the effect of banning, not limiting, but actually banning a great deal of speech that was legal even before the Supreme Court's decisions in Citizens United versus FEC and Buckley v. Vallejo. So again, this law goes backwards to outlaw speech that was always legal in American history, even before the Citizens United decision. As the full text of my prepared remarks explains in greater details these problems of Title VI, but in a nutshell, Title VI should be called the New Alien and Sedition Act. With just a few seconds remaining, let me add only on Title VIII, this seems to be one of the least harmful provisions of the bill, but that's not to say that it is not, like so many other provisions, a bit of overkill. It's interesting to me that it does not include as covered individuals people who have previously lobbied for cities and counties and local government units, and it would normally be the case that those groups lobby extensively in Congress and perhaps should be also checked for a conflict of interest. I also question the assumption of the bill, which seems to be that anybody with a past experience in the private sector is somehow dangerous and should have a legal conflict of interest defined by law before they even take office. I think that's overkill and inappropriate. Thank you very much for your time. I'm free to answer any questions.
Thank you very much to all of our witnesses, and thank you for staying within the time limit. I will now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished lady from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you so much to Chairman Sarbanes for this incredible leadership on this issue. I think for the people, H.R. 1 is important in trying to restore public trust into this institution. And I know I'm a freshman, I'm new. I think a lot of people know that I really truly believe in the rule of law and believe in trying to restore to the core center of getting people to understand this body here works for them. And so as a new member, you know, I see now why a lot of my residents are really taken aback by this process and not feeling like it belongs to them. And through the chair, we all know this is a very critical issue. I think both Republicans and Democrats alike see this as a critical issue in taking corruption out of government. And so for me, as you said about strengthening this, but more importantly, you know, in the first 2 years in office, I think the president made 281 visits to properties he steals profits from. More than 150 political committees, including campaigns and party committees, have spent nearly $5 million at Trump businesses since he became president. At least 13 special interest groups have lobbied the White House around the same time they also did business with the Trump organization. I can go on, I can submit this to record, but one of the things as a person that's coming here as a brand new member, I cannot believe this is not illegal already, that this is not something that we push up against and say enough, because as we step into here, we work for the people. We have to check our businesses, we have to check our personal and professional conflicts. Any lawyer across this country will tell you it is dangerous to allow any sort of conflict to exist while you're trying to serve others, especially in a public position like this. I I have seen modern presidents, both parties, before this president, address these potential conflict of interests by adhering to all ethical norms and traditions that resulted in the sale of their financial interest, completely divesting in their foreign and domestic investments. I'm really taken aback by the fact that we still have to currently now fight for something that's so critically important in restoring public trust, that now we're setting a precedent that it's okay for a president not to divest, that it's okay that I have Gary Cohn, President Trump's Director of National Economic Counsel, received more than $100 million in payments from Goldman Sachs before he came in to work for Trump, the president, I'm sorry, Chairman. And so one of the things that I'm taken aback by is that, we're talking in my good colleague from Ohio mentioned the original H.R. 1 tax break. Who worked on that? Because, back home in the district, they call that a payout. They really do. They know who was behind the scenes running that and pushing that forward. And so my question to you is, how can we move? Because the shoulda, coulda, maybe, and all these to me, that doesn't go far enough to starting to make people feel like this is their house, that this Congress belongs to them. Because right now, all they see is people that are at the top that make millions of dollars that are completely disconnected with the American people. And I can tell you, every single day, from underemployment to poverty in my district, we're feeling like here, we don't have a voice. And so with that, Mr. Schwab, I really would love to hear, how do you think we can really strengthen this, and where the dangerous precedent is? Because more and more, we're now seeing other people interested, former CEOs, others interested in becoming president of the United States.
I applaud the bill for including a statement of Congress that the president should divest. I think that takes a step towards reestablishing the norm, and it would have been helpful to me as director of OGE to be able to point to that. I'd personally like to see it go further and require divestiture, because we have a situation now where people who seek to influence the government can funnel bags of cash to the president through his various properties. You have government contractors, charities, businesses, associations, politicians, political parties, political groups, using his facilities and paying just absolutely gobs of cash for the privilege of hobnobbing with the president. And unfortunately, the president has done nothing to discourage this. He didn't even try to mitigate it by saying, I and my appointees will refuse to attend events at my properties, to discourage people from holding them there because they would lose access to the government by having the event there. Instead, there seems to be this embrace and this encouragement and this sense on the part of interested parties that they have to engage in this to even be on an even footing with their competitors.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady has had 5 seconds, but go ahead.
Oh, I just want to, the constituent you spoke about, do you know in 2017, for example, Saudi lobbyists spent $270,000 to reserve rooms at Trump-owned hotels? And that, to me, makes you pause about your constituent being killed by that government.
I do know that, yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would just point out to the chairman, the witness may want to clarify his remarks when he's saying gobs of cash. I don't know that he would have any proof, and since he's under oath, I don't know that he would want to make that type of statement.
Well, I will allow the gentleman, if you want to clarify what you meant by gobs of cash.
Representative Meadows, what I mean is that people are paying money to the Trump organization to use his facilities, and the direct beneficiary of that money is President Trump because he's the beneficiary of the trust that holds that. So the money is flowing to President Trump, and the steps he's taken to step back from it have had absolutely zero effect in any way diminish the financial interest in the money that comes through. So I do indeed mean that this is a funnel for money, but
you didn't mean
directly
cash
to him. I don't mean they're handing it directly to him.
The gentleman has defined it. Thank you. We will now hear from Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I must have been living in the twilight zone for the first 6 years of my first 8 years. Fast and Furious, Operation Choke Point, Benghazi, the IRS targeting, the intimidation of the press with James Rosen and Cheryl Atkinson, Uranium One, the unmasking of American citizens, and out-of-control DOJ. Really? Really? Mr. Smith, I'm going to concentrate with you. H.R. 1 expands the definition of foreign national. Do you think, however, that it would make sense to strengthen the disclosure requirements in order to prevent foreign nationals from potentially funneling hundreds of millions of dollars to the U.S. campaigns?
The difficult question is always how exactly does one intend to do this? And one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that most regulations that will be imposed will be felt by American citizens. The vast majority of people who will have to comply will be American citizens. So when we engage in this type of thinking, we need to be, careful that we're not giving up our own rights. We fought the Cold War without surrendering our own rights, and now the fact that we're afraid of the rump state of the former Soviet Union is going to somehow destroy America, and so now we should rush to throw away hard-won protections. I think Mr. Jordan talked about them in the cases like NAACP versus Alabama, Talley versus California. We need to be careful. So I do think foreign engagement poses a different issue, but a kind of a scattershot approach that mainly hits American citizens is unwise.
Well, I agree with you, and let's tailor that aspect. So do you think amending the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 to require what is already required of American citizens, the disclosure of the credit verification value, or the CVV, and a legal billing address for all loan contributions would help ensure that the credit cards are registered to someone who actually lives in the United States?
Well, one thing you could do, for example, most campaigns for years did this voluntarily, and this became something of an issue because the Obama campaigns did not, was to put checks in place on credit cards, in particular prepaid credit cards. That is the kind of thing that could be done by regulation through the FEC, or I suppose by statute if there were a desire to do that, to ensure that those credit cards were tied to a U.S. individual, not just sort of handed out to whoever wants to use prepaid credit cards.
Well, and these are two great ideas, a CVV and a billing address. It would actually make sure that somebody's actually living in this country. Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm. Do note that people don't have to live in this country. U.S. citizens living abroad and so on are.
I understand, but this definitely is a means of calibration that would stop some of the illegal contributions.
It would probably be a safeguard, again, one that most campaigns have followed, and one that could be enacted, I think, by either regulation or statute.
Now, the last administration, we saw multiple examples of average American citizens being targeted for their political beliefs, most notably the IRS and FBI targeting political opponents. With that in mind, H.R. 1 would create a partisan FEC, you've addressed that could use the power of the federal government to quell speech that disagrees with it. What effects do you think this will have on free speech and discourse?
Well, I called it the New Alien and Sedition Act, so I think that's a pretty strong statement to put in very general terms. One of the things that has been an issue at the FEC and in enforcement in the states as well and so on is the use of these complaint process as political weapons in and of themselves. It often doesn't matter if you actually even prove a violation. You simply start the investigation process. Responding to an FEC investigation can be very costly. The investigation is intrusive. They can go into your strategy and tactics, tie up campaign time, you get bad press and so on. So often it was said the punishment is the process rather than any fine that's meted out at the end, in part because you quite likely did nothing wrong. So very definitely there can be a chilling effect here. And that chilling effect is most pronounced on small grassroots campaigns, which don't have the lobbyists and the lawyers and so on who know these complex regulations and can deal with them easily.
So, two quick questions. Can you explain what ethics reform, FEC restructuring, and a new federal holiday all have in common?
I suppose they all deal in some way with the federal government. But this is certainly a grab bag of bills. And I would actually suggest that one of the best things the majority could do would be to divide this bill into its component parts so that they can be focused on one at a time. Many of them are only in the most vague sense related.
One last question. Why do you think my good friend from Maryland chose to combine such different topics into one bill? You started in on it, so.
I think that would probably be a question better directed to your good friend from Maryland. I'm not going to try to read his mind.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Yield to the distinguished lady from New York, Ms. Maloney, 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank you and Mr. Sarbanes for your selfless, devoted work on Intro 1 over many years. Mr. Amey, I'd like to ask you about presidential contracts, the ability of the president and vice president now under the law to compete against members of Congress, to compete for properties that other federal employees and members of Congress are barred by law from entering into contracts or leases. And I want to speak to the Presidential Conflicts of Interest Act, which is part of Intro 1, which would put a restriction on the president and the vice president in entering into any contracts, which happens to be the standards for members of Congress and federal employees. Would you agree with the intent of Intro 1's specific proposal on presidential conflicts of interest?
Yes, Congresswoman. Obviously, you're talking about the General Services Agency's lease with President Trump and the Trump Hotel here in Washington, D.C.
Yes, yes.
There is a provision in that lease that is up for debate. Obviously, the GSA and their legal counsel have had different feelings than a lot of people on this side of the table have had about the interpretation of that lease provision. The one problem and why H.R. 1 on this specific provision is necessary is it was in about 1994 that the Federal Acquisition Regulation stripped the provision that was called the Officials Not Benefit provision. And so it was in one of the acquisition reform bills, Federal Acquisition Reform Act or the Services Acquisition Reform Act, but that provision was stripped out. So it's no longer in the FAR. So I think it's important to put back, and you raise a good point, that provision actually mentioned members of Congress at that time, and that has continued for members of Congress, but hasn't affected other people in the executive branch. And so I do think it's necessary.
Well, as many of my colleagues know, in 2017, members of this committee, the Democrats, literally sued for information about the lease and contract between the president's hotel, here, Washington, D.C. hotel, and the lease with the old office building. And we were told then by the General Accounting Services, General Services Administration, that we were not entitled to exercise our oversight responsibilities of reviewing this lease. They barred us from getting this information. So we are literally still in court trying to obtain this. And many of us feel that this is a glaring conflict of interest. Why shouldn't the Oversight Committee have access to leases and contracts that we want to question, even if it includes the President of the United States? Now, in this case of the Trump International Hotel, the President is both the landlord and the tenant, and he ultimately also oversees GSA, the agency that was responsible for enforcing this lease, this contract. And how can Congress, Mr. Amey, or the American people be sure that GSA is really acting impartially in carrying out the law when they are really interpreting what their supervisor?
Well, when you have someone that's the landlord, the tenant, the judge, and the jury, and obviously appointed the head of the General Services Administration, then at that point, it is a major conflict of interest. There were also some concerns because the Trump children were involved in the negotiation of that lease, and I'm actually outraged at the fact that the GSA hasn't turned over the information to Congress. That's where it is important. That's where transparency when it comes to government ethics matters, that we should be seeing as much information about that to remove the appearance of a conflict of interest, but also to ensure that there's not an actual conflict of interest that needs to be resolved.
Okay, now in this particular lease for the old post office building, it explicitly prohibited an elected official from being a party, but GSA failed to enforce it. And I would say that there would definitely be an impact, and I'll ask Mr. Badhani on this.
Mayor Bonney.
There could be a definite conflict of interest that could have a freezing effect on competition. How many people want to compete against the President of the United States for a lease or a contract? Wouldn't you agree that that would be a chilling effect on any competition? What would be the effect of this going forward?
I would agree with that, Congresswoman. And as you know, the Inspector General of the General Services Administration recently released a report that was critical of GSA's analysis of the validity of this lease for improperly omitting constitutional issues from their analysis. And to me, that raises the question of whether there was improper influence or at least the specter of self-dealing to the public that greatly undermines public trust. It's also one of the reasons why I should say that the National Task Force for Democracy and Rule of Law, which is a Brennan Center initiative that includes some of your former colleagues and a bipartisan group of former Republicans and Democrats, and they've proposed extending the existing prohibition and the conflicts of interest law to the president and vice president to avoid specific instances like this.
And that's what Intro 1 will do, and I strongly support it and urge its passage. I yield back.
Distinguished gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. Mr. Marbani, I guess you're in favor of matching dollars, using taxpayer dollars to match small donations as is outlined in H.R. 1. Is that correct?
The Brennan Center does support the proposal in H.R. 1, which is modeled after an existing proposal that has existed for years in New York, which multiple reports...
Yeah, I've only got 5 minutes. Yes or no? Do you support it?
Yes.
Okay, and so I guess here's the interesting fact that I just find just fascinating. A Democrat bill, H.R. 1, would actually use taxpayer dollars to reelect the Freedom Caucus chairman. Under their bill, I would get almost $4 million of taxpayer dollars. And I would say, I don't see any of my constituents in the audience here. I can't imagine that they would be happy with taxpayer dollars being used to reelect a Freedom Caucus chairman. Do you not see a problem when we use taxpayer dollars to reelect individual members of Congress?
If I may...
I mean, would you support me financially?
I would support my spending the equivalent that H.R. 1 would require, which I think is $1 per citizen per year over 10 years.
No,
yes.
it's a matching deal. We've done the math. It's $3.8 million that I would get because I'm one of the top 10 in terms of small dollar donations in Congress. I would get $3.8 million under this bill for reelection. I cannot find anyone who holds government accountable that would think that that would be a wise use of taxpayer dollars. Would you?
Sir, campaigns need to be funded from somewhere, and I would say
agree,
that
but
right now...
Not my taxpayer dollars shouldn't be going to it, sir. Mr. Schwab, let me come to you. Are you in support of H.R. 1's investigative mandate for OGE?
You know,
you were in the job.
I have said publicly that I'd prefer to see an inspector general that has global authority over every agency that doesn't have an inspector general, and have supplemental ethics authority upon referral to OGE. That's a proposal I've presented to former Chairman Gowdy and current Chairman Cummings. I do support the current bill because I don't think it transforms...
But it has investigative authority. I've gone through it, Mr. Schwab.
No, I do.
And let me tell you why I'm concerned. Because you came before my committee.
Yes.
And you gave sworn testimony.
Yes, I did.
Which is exactly opposite of H.R. 1. And yet here you are today espousing its merits, and I can't find why all of a sudden you would have this newfound interest to have investigative authority if it were not directed at the current President of the United States.
Yeah, I have two statements about that. One is, I don't think it creates the kind of investigative authority that an inspector general does. So I don't think all investigative authority is created equally.
I agree with that, but it goes well beyond your testimony.
But it does create some, and my views on that have changed. But this proposal
with this president,
this proposal would not apply only to this president. It would apply to the next president.
Listen, it's not my first rodeo. It's not yours either. But what I'm saying is, I find it extremely hypocritical that you would come here today, having sworn under oath that this was not the way to go, when there was a different president in the White House, and then here today and followed it up with a letter. I mean, we've got numerous quotes from you over and over and over again, which would undermine H.R. 1, and yet here you are today supporting that. How do you have this evolution in such a short period of time, Mr. Schwab?
Well, first of all, I was telling the truth then, and I'm telling the truth now, so let's be clear about that. I did disagree with the idea of investigative authority back then. I've now sat for 2 years and watched...
So you were just wrong back then?
No, I wasn't.
Because I was suggesting that you should have the investigative authority, and you said, quote, let me quote you, hold on.
No, I recall you suggested...
Let me quote you here. I said, so you do not want the authority to be able to investigate it? No, I don't think so. I said, you don't want it. And quote, well, I don't think we should have it. What I might want one way or another is not relevant, as it would not be the right thing. Close quote. All of a sudden today, you're having an epiphany and it's changing, Mr. Schwab?
No, it's not all of a sudden at all. It's after watching for 2 years, somebody proved to me that the executive branch ethics program was much weaker and much more fragile than I ever thought it was. Frankly, I was naive. I never imagined a president could come in and refuse to eliminate his conflicts of interest, have appointees who are completely disinterested in government ethics, and have, with all respect, a Congress refuse to exercise oversight over them in that respect. And so in the absence of any other avenue, I do now believe that the Office of Government Ethics is going to have to fill the gap.
But Mr. Schwab, that was precisely the point I made in 2015, and you disagreed with me then. I yield back.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
just say you were right.
Thank you very much.
We can agree on that.
Thank you very much. We'll now hear from Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And unrelated to my question, I do want to thank Mr. Sarbanes for the findings in H.R. 1 regarding the D.C. Statehood Act, because these findings simply speak for themselves. People I represent pay the highest taxes per capita in the United States. I do vote in the Committee of the Whole, but have no final vote on the House floor. I'm grateful to have a vote in this committee. And I thank you, Chairman Cummings, for agreeing to hold a hearing on this bill. Look, I want to speak about the parts of H.R. 1 which simply go to transparency. I think my first question to Ms. Hobert Flynn, but I'd also like to hear Mr. Smith's view of this question. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and her family have donated millions of dollars to organizations who lobby for education policy. Do either of you think that the public has a right to know if the Secretary has donated substantially to organizations, her background in donating, that could now influence her policies as Secretary? First, Ms. Flynn, and I'd like to hear Mr. Smith on this question.
Thank you. You know, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos and her family have given large sums of money to influence politics at all levels of government, including pressing for school voucher programs, something she's clearly very supportive of. According to the Center for Responsive Politics, DeVos and her family have donated over $20 million to Republican candidates, party committees, PACs, and super PACs. And much of that political spending has been focused on education, as she now influences an education secretary. You know, to me, I think it's important when the Senate is looking at the nomination, when the American people are paying attention. It's an important part of the equation that helps shed light both on issues that she cares about and also her investment in that. And in fact, she gave an interview in Roll Call where she said she, quote, decided, quote, to stop taking offense at the suggestion that we are buying influence. Quote, now I simply concede the point. She wrote 20 years ago, they are right. We do expect some things in return. We expect to foster a conservative governing philosophy consisting of limited government and respect for traditional American values. So I think it's important for the nomination process to have a fuller picture of where their fundraising and political spending is going.
Mr. Smith, how could that do any harm? How can it do anything but good the more information we have?
I have to say, shocked to discover that the Republican appointee to Secretary of Education has been a Republican who has donated to Republican candidates and causes, and that her viewpoints.
So would you be shocked then for
groups.
us to know, for the public to know about that background history as she takes office?
I think that's, as Ms. Hobart Flynn said, I agree that's something that certainly senators could ask during the confirmation process. I find it hard to believe that there's an ethical conflict in somebody actually
That may
taking
not be
office.
reclaiming my time. I'm not implying an ethical comment. And my questions about transparency are simply going to that. You know, let it all hang out, and then let everybody make their own judgment.
Well,
let the committee make its own judgment. Let the public make its own judgment.
Ms. Norton, I have a number of questions about your personal life I'd be very interested in, but I won't ask them here today.
Well, go straight ahead.
You know,
the point is, it's not her personal life that I'm asking about, Mr. Smith. What we're asking about is her donations of money.
These are not
donations of money that, in ways that could reflect on a trust she's now been given as part of her enforcement activities. So it's not about just let it all hang out about my personal life. It's about the relevance to what it is she is enforcing. She is enforcing education policy. She's had a known, not only position, but given millions of dollars in ways that may conflict with parts of that policy. As I indicated when I opened this line of questioning, it's only about transparency. Let me go on to ask about the Conflicts of Political Fundraising Act. I'm a co-sponsor of that. It's also an H.R. 1. It simply requires... Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Jordan.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Professor Smith, does H.R. 1 require states to offer early voting?
Yes.
Does H.R. 1, Professor, require states to offer no excuse absentee voting?
Yes.
Does H.R. 1 require paid leave for federal workers to be poll workers?
Yes.
Does H.R. 1 require states to let released felons vote?
I believe it does.
Does H.R. 1 require taxpayers to finance campaigns?
Definitely.
Definitely. Does H.R. 1 require taxpayers, as Mr. Meadows was alluding to just a few minutes ago, does H.R. 1 require taxpayers to pay for the campaigns of candidates they oppose?
Yes. For example, under the system, if I were to contribute $10 to the reelection campaign of the president, the folks on this side of the aisle would collectively, with others, contribute $6 or something like that.
Yep. Does H.R. 1 require states to have same-day registration for voters?
I believe it does.
Does H.R. 1 require automatic voter registration?
I believe that's correct.
Does H.R. 1 encourage states to pre-register 16-year-olds?
That I don't know off the top of my head.
I'll fill that one. It does.
I'll take your word for it.
I appreciate that. Professor, does H.R. 1 require Election Day to be a federal holiday if you work for the federal government?
Yes, it does.
And does H.R. 1 require the outing of donors? Direct violation of freedom of association. You give to a campaign, you permits that through the disclosure, you're going to be outed to the public.
A great many provisions require a tremendous amount of outing of a great many donors.
Does H.R. 1 make the bipartisan FEC a partisan organization?
I believe that it effectively does.
Yeah, and the example, I like the example you used. We'll take the United States Senate. Let's say Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz are the Republicans. Let's say Cory Booker and Kamala Harris are the Democrats, and then the independent is Bernie Sanders. And that's supposed to be balanced, right?
That would work, yes.
And that would work. And that's exactly what the majority intends for it to be in 2021. Something like that. Maybe not those people, but I think people understand what we're getting at here. Does H.R. 1 limit free speech?
I believe that it does in significant ways, as I pointed out in my testimony, in ways that it was not limited even before some of the Supreme Court decisions that H.R. 1 purports to want to overturn.
So let me take a whack at a little summary here, Professor. H.R. 1 requires taxpayers to pay for a holiday on Election Day for government workers. H.R. 1 requires taxpayers to pay for 6 days of paid leave for government workers who want to be poll workers. H.R. 1 requires taxpayers to pay for politicians' campaigns, and if those same taxpayers give to some organization, some C4, they can be outed under H.R. 1 so that the left can, or anyone, could harass them or their family.
Yes.
Such a deal for the taxpayer, right?
I'll leave that judgment to you folks who get to vote on it.
I mean, this is exactly where H.R. 1 sends us. And that's why we're opposed to it. That's why we're going to keep fighting it. That's why we're saying the things we're saying. So anything I'm missing in my summary there, Professor, anything you'd like to add?
I would only add that I think that the disclosure provisions are often worse than people think because they're defining as political activity things that have never been defined as political before, and you run the risk of regulations swallowing up the entire discourse in which public engages. So I would only say that I think the provisions are worse than people think and that they're often hidden through the complex interrelationship of different provisions.
Give us an example.
Well, one example would be if an organization, for example, were to hire somebody who'd previously been an intern, paid intern for a member of Congress, that organization would then be prohibited from making any communications that were deemed to promote, attack, support, or oppose that candidate. And that vague term could apply to almost anything, praising the candidate for introducing a bill, criticizing the congressman for opposing a bill, whatever it might be.
Wow, that'd put the whole consultant business in this town out of business, it seems to me.
It's not just the consulting business, though. Of course, it puts out of business all of the interest groups and all of the civic groups that people belong to.
All right, I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield myself a few minutes. One of the things that Ms. Hobert and Mr. Mabrani that gave me chills when I read it was the 2016 opinion of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. You know, we're sitting around here acting not like it's not an inalienable right to be able to vote. And it's something they said that is chilling. And we can argue back and forth all we want. And they talked about the legislature down there in North Carolina. And this is a quote from the Fourth Circuit. These are federal judges. They said, before enacting that law, the legislature requested data on the use by race of a number of voting practices. Upon receipt of the race data, the General Assembly enacted legislation that restricted, come on, you talk about inalienable rights, that restricted voting and registration in 5 different ways, all of which disproportionately affected African Americans. They went on to say, this is the Fourth Circuit. I didn't say this. The federal court said it. Said in response to claims that intentional racial discrimination animated its action, the state offered only meager justifications. Although the new provisions target, this is what the court said, although the new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision, they constitute inapt remedies for the problems assertedly justifying them, and in fact impose cures for problems that did not even exist. They went on to say, thus, the asserted justifications cannot and do not conceal the state's true motivation, end of quote. The reason why that quote means so much to me is that 1 year ago today, on my mother's dying bed at 92 years old, former sharecropper, her last words were do not let them take our votes away from us. They had fought, she had fought and seen people harmed, beaten, trying to vote. Talk about inalienable rights. Voting is crucial, and I don't give a damn how you look at it. There are efforts to stop people from voting. That's not right. This is not Russia. This is the United States of America. And I will fight until the death to make sure every citizen, whether they're Green Party, whether they're Freedom Party, whether they're Democrat, whether they're Republican, whoever has that right to vote. Because it is the essence of our democracy. And we can play around and act like it's not. And guess what? I want to be clear that when they look back on this moment 200 years from now, that there are those of us who stood up, and they'll be able to say they stood up and said, we will defend, they defended the right to vote. Because you know what the problem is? For so many people, their rights are pulled away from them, then they got to put in laws to get them back. Pulled away from them. What does that mean? They cannot progress rapidly. They cannot progress with the rest of society. And all they're trying to do is trying to control their own destiny. I'd like to just hear your comments, Ms. Hobert and Mr. Mabrani, on the Fourth Circuit's opinion.
So we have seen since 2010 a number of states move efforts to shut down opportunities for people to vote. We've seen proof of citizenship laws, photo ID. We've seen early voting days repealed. We have seen states that have election day registration repealed, all in efforts to make it difficult for people to vote. A lot of this is focused on so-called in-person voter fraud, which there is a 0.0003% chance that happens. It is a very rare thing. So what we have is all these measures that are trying to tap down on something that isn't happening out there, and the end result is we see many people purge from voter rolls and other things with the thought that they're going to be addressing something that isn't happening very frequently. And so that is a real challenge, and one that we've seen in states across the country. And the reforms in H.R. 1 to put in place early voting, to deal with voting machines and so that they're working and functioning, to add poll workers where we have a real shortage in poll workers so people aren't standing in line and leaving. All of these things are put in place to help create opportunities for people to vote. Election day registration is a perfect antidote to a purge so that you can show up on election day. If you see that there's a problem, then you can register to vote and vote on that day. And that's why it's so important to be looking at these reforms.
Running.
The one thing I want to add to that is that these reforms not just make it easier for people to vote and are proven to increase turnout and participation, they actually increase the accuracy of the rolls. So what we're hearing as reasons not to adopt things like automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration. As was said earlier, these are reforms that already exist in states across the country, and the Brennan Center has studied the implementation of them, and they've shown to increase the accuracy of the poll and to even decrease existing errors in the system. And I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your telling that incredibly personal story and the impact that it had on me personally, and I'm sure on everyone who is listening.
Mr. Heiss.
I thank the chairman, and I would just, Mr. Chairman, all of us want integrity at the voting booth, but if you are somehow implying that only Republicans have been engaged in voter fraud, I challenge that and take great offense at it. We just saw in Texas tens of thousands of illegal aliens voting, And this is an issue that goes far and wide. It is not on one side of the aisle, sir, and I would like that to stand corrected. And this bill does not correct
Would
that
the gentleman
problem.
yield?
Yes, sir.
And I'll give you your seconds back. Nobody said that. I didn't say that. I quoted the court, and I did not just blame Republicans or anybody. All I know, I was trying to make it clear that it has been made far difficult for people who look like me to be able to vote, period. And we all need to be addressing that. That's what I was trying to say.
Reclaiming my time.
If you took it any other way, I did not intend it that way.
It was certainly implied that way, Mr. Chairman. And I accept what you just said. My contention across the board, however, H.R. 1 does not address this problem. It makes the potential for voter fraud even a greater possibility. This is not a solution to the problem that all of us in this room are concerned about. Mr. Smith, I'd like to go to you. Should taxpayers be required to pay for political speech?
Well, I think there are a couple of points here. One is a sort of a moral point that was raised earlier by Mr. Meadows and by Mr. Jordan, that there's something sort of deeply wrong about forcing people to fund the political campaigns of candidates they greatly abhor. But there's also a practical problem here.
Well, let me go on. All right. Yeah. So yes or no?
I think clearly not. But I do understand there are practical problems with it as well. It's not just an ideological.
Well, absolutely. Maybe we'll have time to get into some of that. So they should not be required to pay for political speech. I'm assuming you would also agree that they should not be required to pay for political speech that they disagree with.
Well, in particular, yes.
All right. Our colleagues on the other side have pointed to so-called success in expanding public funding of election in places like Arizona, Maine, New York, and so forth. So far as you're aware, have these programs been successful?
No, typically the measure they use for that is how many candidates choose to take the money. So they're kind of saying, well, if the government offers you free money and you take it, wow, the program was successful. But in terms of quality of governance, almost all the claims do not come true. We're told that it would elect more minorities. That's not been the case. It should elect more women. That's not been the case. You don't see much difference in the makeup of legislatures. And I certainly don't think people look at, New York City and say, wow, now that they've had this matching program, they're well-governed, better governed than in the past.
So have these programs been successful then in preventing corruption?
I don't see any way that they have. In fact, they're often an avenue for corruption because, again, you have things that were previously private money. People, if they, if a candidate wants to waste money, he can do it. Now it's public money. If he diverts it to personal use, it creates a greater scandal.
Do these programs really limit the influence of special interest groups?
Not seen that at all, in part because particularly with these matching fund types of things, groups that are well organized to go out and solicit large amounts of small contributions can do that. They also invite fraud in the sense that in the past, a person might contribute to $250,000 or $500,000, but now he tries to get a bunch of other people to each contribute an amount below the matching amount and give them money to make the contributions because then you up the matches. So they're really sort of an invitation to corruption.
You touched on this a while ago. I'd like for you to go a little bit further, but what will this program do to public discourse and free speech?
Well, public financing programs, I think, are not helpful for free speech, in part because, again, they tend to be avenues for corruption in many ways. We also find there are studies that show that the small donors that are often solicited for these things actually tend to be more partisan donors than sort of more institutional people, so that they tend to lead to further polarization of the political system.
Okay, one last question. Going back, it was interesting to me when you mentioned the 5-member versus 6-member on the FEC. Can you elaborate on that, why 6 members, in your opinion, is the appropriate way to go as opposed to 5?
Sure. It's a unique commission in the sense that it directly regulates elections and who's going to win those offices, or it can have that effect. So it has always required 4 votes on a 6-member commission. That is, you had to have some measure of bipartisanship. Once you go to a 5-member commission, you'll lose that requirement of bipartisanship. Furthermore, it will totally go away because the chair, again, will have this tremendous authority on his own, even if all other commissioners oppose him, to subpoena people and launch investigations and so on.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Raskin of Maryland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first start by applauding the sentiments that you just expressed. There's been a profound struggle for the right to vote in American history. We began with the vast majority of people in our country not having the right to vote, but through political struggle and constitutional change, we have enlarged the electorate to include African Americans and to include women, to include 18-year-olds. We've dismantled the property and wealth qualifications. And at every turn, there have been forces of conservatism and reaction that have tried to stop the changes, oftentimes claiming fraud, oftentimes claiming that the people newly enfranchised weren't really truly deserving voters. And so we're seeing the same historical process reenacted right now. But that's just the first part of the issue. Once we get people elected to office, there's the problem of the agency of people who go into government. The founders of the Constitution wrote in Article 1, Section 9, the Emoluments Clause, to make sure that the president and other federal officials would not be on the take from foreign powers, kings, princes, and governments, would accept no money at all, no payments whatsoever, no offices, no titles, no emoluments. And yet, with that signal original breach, that original sin, this administration basically opened the floodgates on corruption in Washington and then appointed a fox to preside over every hen house in Washington, every regulatory agency taken over by a regulated industry. So we need to protect the right to vote against these constant efforts to take people's right to vote away, and we need to make sure that the people who come to work in Washington are actually serving the American people. And that's what part of this legislation is all about. It's about strengthening the Office of Government Ethics. And it includes the Executive Branch Comprehensive Ethics Enforcement Act, which I'm proud to introduce on the House side, along with Senator Blumenthal on the Senate side. One of the things it would do is to provide the director of the Office of Government Ethics with the same authority that inspectors general have to subpoena documents. And I'm wondering, Mr. Amey, starting with you, how would this help the work of the OGE director? And can you give us some examples of what that might mean?
Well, specifically, I mean, that's one of the problems. The OGE currently has some authorities. They're very limited authorities to conduct investigations, hold a hearing, and ask government officials to come in and testify. But that needs to be strengthened. We have found that OGE is really a paper tiger. Without this authority, it's very difficult. The ethics system is really based on self-policing. You know, from day one, I mean, it's up to a government official to come to an ethics officer and disclose certain things. It's during the confirmation process, it's up to them to go to OGE and make certain disclosures. And that's where at least allowing OGE to subpoena and hold the proper investigation with the proper information in front of them will instill the fact that, you know, we're trying to get to the conflicts of interest and whatever waivers, recusals, or exemptions apply to make it more transparent so we're aware of those conflicts and we can handle them in due course.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schwab, you testified before this committee in 2015 while you were the director of the Office of Government Ethics. And during that hearing, Mr. Chaffetz, who was then the chairman of the committee, was frustrated with some of your testimony because the OGE was not doing its own investigations, and he thought it was toothless. He said, and I quote, "And I'm just suggesting that you're just shuffling paperwork. If you're just taking everything at face value and then reprinting and putting it up on the shelf, what good are you? Why should we even have you if you're not going to actually review them and hold people accountable and do an investigation?" H.R. 1 would, in fact, give OGE precisely the authority to do meaningful investigations that Chairman Chaffetz and our counterparts on the other side of the aisle were demanding then. Isn't that right?
I think that's absolutely right. At the time, I tried to explain that as a practical matter, despite the appearance of language that might look like investigative authority in the current version of the Ethics in Government Act, OGE was powerless to actually conduct any kind of investigation. This bill would change that.
I wonder if you would give us a sense of this culture of corruption and lawlessness which now permeates Washington. Most people would be astounded to know that people come to Washington, go into a federal agency, not in order to pursue the common good and protect the public interest, but in order to pursue other agendas. Can you suggest from your wide experience in this field what those other agendas might be?
Well, I think one of the concerns that we look at is the types of loyalties that they have. And the goal of any ethics program should be to ensure that the loyalty of the government officials is only to the people they serve and not to companies for which they previously lobbied or previously served as a high-level executive or anything like that.
And Mr. Amey, let me come to you.
If I may, I think the one problem that we've seen with the ethics system is even if you look at OG's prosecution surveys, or if you would go back through the public integrity section at the Department of Justice, most of it is low-hanging fruit. I mean, most of it is low-level people that are, handling a contract or doing something. As you go up the chain of command, the ethics laws kind of dwindle off, and I truly believe it's kind of a catch-me-if-you-can system these days.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Stoneman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Cummings, I don't want to make it harder for people to vote. I just want to make sure that elections are fair and that only eligible voters vote. I'm from rural Kentucky. Many elections, this past election cycle, were decided by 10 votes or less. But I have a huge problem with the proposal for same-day voter registration. What I witnessed in California this past federal election cycle with the questionable ballot harvesting gave me grave concerns about the integrity of our elections and who is actually casting votes in some states that have passed this type of version of election reform. So I want to ask my first question to Mr. Smith and to touch upon what Congressman Heiss mentioned. This proposal, one of the things it does is it removes the standard of the chairman and vice chairman being from separate parties. In Kentucky, we have a board of elections, and it's split down the middle. Kentucky, it's half Republican, half Democrat. How might consolidating power in the hands of a single party and a chairman of a single party undermine the legitimacy of the Federal Election Commission?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, historically, it's required bipartisanship. There has to be some degree of buy-in from one commissioner who's identified with the other side of the aisle, and that disappears here. As we pointed out, in theory, independent commissioner doesn't need to be truly independent, but it's even worse than that, actually, because if the president simply doesn't fill certain positions, then a three-member quorum, which could be 2 members of one party and 1 independent or something, could be free to launch whatever investigations it chose past the regulations. The regulations that you pass, of course, can be terribly biased in favor of one party or the other, but also the enforcement process, the priorities you choose, how you choose to go after people, whether you choose to pursue certain folks can be very damaging. And as I pointed out, oftentimes the punishment is in the process itself. You get bad press, your resources become tied up, and this can be on charges that are very bogus, that have almost no real foundation in fact. So a partisan FEC is a very dangerous potential weapon, and it's worth noting that groups that, from time to time the FEC will get criticized. Republicans will say something like, this is a biased agency. And the very first response that always comes out of the mouth of people like some of the organizations represented down the table here is, requires some degree of bipartisanship, right? See, they themselves know that that's really the only thing that gives the agency its legitimacy, is that bipartisan makeup.
Right. Following up on that, this proposal, H.R. 1, also allows the general counsel to initiate an investigation without bipartisan support and issue subpoenas on his own authority. Does the bill provide sufficient checks on the general counsel to make sure this significant authority is not abused?
Well, I don't think it does. I mean, there is the possibility for the commission to override the general counsel's actions, but if the commission doesn't act, doesn't have time to act, for some reason or another can't muster a quorum, the general counsel can simply plow ahead. Plus, it allows the commissioners themselves to dodge any responsibility. They can simply not vote and let the general counsel's recommendation move forward. And note that first general counsel will be appointed by the chair with concurrence of 2 other commissioners. He doesn't need concurrence of 2 others for this, but those will all be people appointed by this first president who makes that appointment. And once he's in, he can stay in indefinitely unless you can muster a majority to vote him out.
Let me ask you this last question. The asserted purpose of H.R. 1 is to increase transparency in the electoral process. I think we would all support that. But in what way does creating a secretive, taxpayer-funded, blue ribbon panel to lobby the president about whom to appoint to the FEC increase transparency?
Well, this is a fascinating little part of the bill. One part of the bill requires the creation of this blue ribbon panel that's supposed to make recommendations to the president as to whom he ought to appoint to the FEC. It's not quite clear what the purpose of the panel is, since they don't have binding authority, but it is very interesting that the first thing the bill does then is take this body out of the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which exists precisely to make sure that it operates transparently and it allows it to operate in secret.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your comments earlier. A clear reminder for all of us here as to what our obligations are to all Americans. In 2010, Citizens United was settled by the Supreme Court. In that decision, the majority made it very clear that they did not think that decision would have virtually any impact on dark, soft money coming into the election process. The reality is, in that same year, there was approximately $140 million of dark money that came into the election process, yet in 2016, it was $1.6 billion. $1.6 billion. All because the Supreme Court decision basically said corporations are people too. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I've never held hands with a corporation. I've never dated a corporation. I've never made out with a corporation. And I'm pretty sure no one else in this room has either. We know that dark money leads to undue influence at best and at worst, outright corruption. At the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia in Independence Hall, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted by our founders, Benjamin Franklin was exiting the building, and a citizen came up to him and asked him, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government do we have? And he answered and said, a republic, if you can keep it. Let that be a reminder to all of us as we contemplate the amount of dark money and soft money coming into our government and the ethics that can be corrupted by it, that this is something that our founders never envisioned. Now more than ever, we do need to restore decency, transparency, and responsibility by introducing ethics reforms for the President, Vice President, and all federal officers and employees. This administration has had, at best, a very awkward relationship with ethics and integrity. We must make sure that the President and his family members do not use the presidency to enrich themselves at the expense of the American people. I know every single one of my colleagues here didn't come to Congress to get rich. They came here because they believe in America, in putting service above self and country over party. We can do that by passing common sense reforms to our political system. Let's work together to reduce the influence of big money in politics, strengthen our rules for public servants. With that, I'd like to ask Mr. Schwab, does current law prohibit all federal employees from taking official actions to benefit their own financial interest? And if so, what gray areas still exist that need to be addressed?
Well, I think the biggest gap is that it doesn't cover the president or vice president. And it's important to remember that that exemption was not supposed to be some kind of perk of high office, but rather a recognition that a president can't really recuse, not participate in urgent matters of state, which is why divestiture was always the practice until now. I think there are other conflicts of interest in the form of these golden parachutes where people are not sufficiently kept out of matters affecting those companies that give them big payouts. And I think that there's an oversight problem that's become apparent that there just is a limited ability to be able to get into the matter and find the information because OGE doesn't have the authority to do it. And I think this bill addresses that.
So yes, please.
Congressman, I just also want to point out the fact that obviously there's some constitutional issues with applying certain ethics rules and regulations to the president. Some of those have been handled, and I think the provision in H.R. 1 that specifically talks about this, that was the sense of Congress in the rules don't apply, but they should act as if they do, actually follows the precedent of, in 1974, of Assistant Attorney General Scalia, in which he said the rules don't apply, but it's good policy, and that the exemptions to them when they don't apply should be common, and should be transparent, so that we can follow that and be aware of it. And so, you know, this isn't a partisan issue. The bill actually has come out where OLC and the Department of Justice has said that has been the precedent for this, you know, for 30, 40 years.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Cloud, you're next.
Thank you, Chairman. There's no doubt that government is broken. This Congress, especially, I can tell you after being here 6 months, my thoughts on that matter have only been confirmed. But for all the what we'll assume are the best intentions, historically centralizing power has only led to more corruption. I think a great example of this was how we saw the IRS weaponized against groups that didn't agree with the political leaning at the time. I'm also puzzled by the kind of thinking that says, well, we don't trust government, so let's give them more power. I think the founders understood this in creating a federalist republic form of government. And Mr. Smith, that brings me to a question. You mentioned in your testimony, I believe I counted 28 times you mentioned the word unconstitutional. Could you speak to some of your concerns with this bill in reference to the Constitution?
Sure, and I'll focus on the speech parts because that's what the Institution for Free Speech does, the Institute for Free Speech. One of the things it does, for example, is it would regulate speech that uses the term, the bill uses the term promotes, supports, attacks, or opposes a candidate. That term is extremely vague. It's not really clear what it means. If somebody were to, if a union were to take out an ad saying it's unfair that federal employees should have to be laid off during a shutdown, you know, tell President Trump to reopen the government. Is that attacking President Trump or not? The Supreme Court has long said you have to have a clear standard so that people know what they can say and what they don't when they have to start reporting to the federal government when their ability to finance ads is limited in different ways. So that's one thing, the vagueness of that phrase and other phrase. Another example would be that the bill presumes that certain people are coordinated or coordinating their activities with candidates, even if they are not actually, in fact, coordinating their activities with candidates. I used an example earlier in response to one of your colleagues, noting that, for example, if you had a former intern, paid intern, go off and work for a citizens group and they had concerns about the bill, about some bill, they would be prohibited from advertising on that because anything they did would be considered coordinated, even if it wasn't, and because they're a corporation, they can't do coordinated expenditures at all. So this would mean, for example, if somebody were to leave the minority staff and go, or majority staff and go to work for the ACLU, at that point, the ACLU would have to be quiet on any kind of legislation they might want to comment on. That's clearly unconstitutional under a case called Colorado Republican Campaign Committee. The Supreme Court said you can't presume coordination. People actually have to engage in coordination before you can tell them that you can limit their political speech. So those would be just two quick examples where I think the bill clearly goes off the rails and into the teeth of existing constitutional law.
Thank you. This bill also purports to limit foreign influence in the elections. Could you speak to how this limits foreign interference, namely to illegal immigrants voting in our elections?
I'm not really prepared to talk about how it pertains. Obviously, illegal immigrants are not allowed to vote in U.S. elections. You know, we've not, because we're a speech organization, we've not really commented much on the voting rights provisions of the bill. I will say that one thing that's often overlooked is the issue is not really that illegal immigrants might vote in elections. I think the more legitimate concern is that illegal immigrants then count in the census, and thus they inflate the congressional representation of areas in which they tend to settle. And it's no secret that those areas have tended to be, in recent years, areas represented by Democrats. So essentially, it's a way that you kind of boost Democratic representation because these non-voters are included in the population. Now, that may not be an inherently wrong thing. There's different theories of regulation or of representation, but that is the effect there.
Well, can you speak to any certain provisions in this bill that might secure the vote for citizens?
Secure the vote for citizens?
Yes.
I'm not quite sure I follow. Sorry, Congressman.
Any provisions in the bill that ensure that only citizens are voting in our elections?
I don't think there are any that take that approach at all. Indeed, to the extent people are worried about that, the bill probably has provisions that cut the other direction.
Okay. Could you then address whether or not minority groups would have their vote count more or less should illegal immigrants be invited to vote?
Well, I'm not sure it would change whether other votes would count more or less. It would have an impact, of course, on the makeup of the electorate, and that would obviously have an impact on who wins the elections at some point.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud. Next up is Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Schwab. The Presidential Transition Act allows candidates for the incoming Commander-in-Chief to submit transition team members who would be eligible to receive selected security clearances. And the current process is clearly very flawed. I think you referenced that in your opening remarks. There's really no transparency and a risk of compromising our national security. And we've got familiar facts here. The Trump transition team requested a security clearance for his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and that gave him access to classified information that we now know he should not have had. His history of failing to report meetings, extensive business relationships, should and apparently did raise red flags that he could potentially be compromised. And just a couple of weeks ago, we learned that federal specialists proposed rejecting his application because of concerns about his family business and his foreign contacts, travel, and meetings that he had during the campaign, and that he could potentially be subject to undue influence. Now we know that those same specialists were overruled by their politically appointed supervisor, Mr. Carl Klein. And in fact, Mr. Chairman, as I'm sure you are aware, Mr. Klein overruled 30 such clearances, which is an unprecedented amount. Apparently, there had only been one prior overruling, I think, in the history of that process. Now, for the record, the committee might recall, I actually proposed 2 amendments in the Appropriations bill in 2017 to revoke Mr. Kushner's security clearance because he repeatedly violated the rules and didn't report meetings that he had had because he forgot about them. I don't know about you, but I generally remember the foreign contact meetings, and I have a record of them. I don't just forget them and repeatedly have to amend applications. Most people wouldn't. So it's strained credulity to suggest that these were meetings that he didn't remember. So we can't have the fox watching the hen house any longer. And this bill at least takes a step towards transparency, but how can we ensure that these overrulings are no longer allowed? And what steps do you think need to be taken to make sure that people in the White House and the executive branch who should not have security clearances don't have them, can't get them, and have them revoked when they've been temporarily granted?
Well, I think that turning first to your comments about the transition team, I think it's very important that this bill addresses ethics for the transition team. It's well established that it's not governmental, yet it does receive governmental funds. Right. It's full of people who are about to become government officials, and it's full of people who are getting access to information. In terms of the security clearance process, I don't have specific recommendations on that. That's not my specialty. It is important, however, to depoliticize it as much as possible and take steps to make sure that there isn't political interference in the security clearance process. I also think in this case we have a nepotism problem where you've got an individual who repeatedly amended his security clearance form. I have never in all my years seen as many amendments to a financial disclosure reform as he had to make. And I think that this is the kind of thing that would ordinarily potentially lead to either a termination or a revocation of security clearance, but you've got a president's son-in-law in office, which is another major departure from the prior 50 years of governmental practice.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Mabani?
If I just may say on security clearances, having worked on hundreds of these, not once out of all of my experience in the White House do I recall overruling the decisions of a career professional. And I think making sure that that process is led by career professionals is one way to prevent that from occurring. Another way, especially for those who are nominated to Senate-confirmed positions, is ensuring that their background investigations are fully completed before those folks are nominated and considered by the Senate.
And Mr. Mabani, if I can ask you, since you do have experience in reviewing those security clearances, why do you think that, why did you not, do you not recall any of the clearances you reviewed being overruled?
I don't recall any being overruled.
But for, I mean, for what valid reason would there be to overrule a recommendation that someone not be granted a security clearance? What's the risk of doing that?
So I never viewed myself as an expert, and it requires expert experience and training to understand the different factors that go into conducting a background investigation, what factors should be considered derogatory and potentially put an individual at risk of compromise, or other ways put national security at risk. And so I deferred to the professionals who did that for many years.
It's your opinion that potentially national security is jeopardized with the overruling of these recommendations?
I do think it puts national security at risk, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mabry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
You're welcome. I recognize Mr. Armstrong for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question is for Mr. Smith. First, do you know the only state in the country without voter registration?
No.
Well, I'm going to give everybody a little trivia lesson. It's North Dakota.
That was my guess,
and
I'm under oath.
One of the things I think we run into when we do a federal one-size-fits-all piece of legislation is maybe the negative disparate impact it would have on certain rural states that do things in a very unique way, which we're very proud of. North Dakota is the only state in the country without voter registration. We have an incredibly robust rural voting program. We have counties that vote exclusively by mail, and we have developed these programs with input from our citizens, our electorate, our county officials, and dealing with those issues. We currently have no excuse absentee voting. We allow felons to vote immediately upon release from prison. Our poll workers are almost exclusively volunteers across the entire state. So in short, we have the best and easiest voting booth access in the entire country, and we are incredibly proud of that. We also are set up somewhat uniquely in that we have cities, counties, legislative districts, and one very big congressional district. But we have also gone through a lot of different issues, and one of the questions I have is each of these counties interacts differently with their voters based on the resources available to them. And if I read this bill, it requires mandatory 15-day early voting. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
So what if you're an exclusively vote-by-mail county?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, if you're an exclusively vote-by-mail county, you have a long period to vote generally.
So, and so in some of our counties, we actually go earlier than 15 days. Some of them we go shorter, but we have extended hours till like 10 p.m. So when we do mandatory early voting, is that required in each district or each precinct, or how? I mean, we set things up differently. Like in our larger city, we have 5 legislative districts, but our early voting is at 1 or 2 locations in that city.
As I understand the bill, it would require all citizens have an opportunity for early voting. I'm not aware if it specifies all the polling locations where those have to take place.
And we do, we have gone through significant affidavit reform in our state and have dealt with these issues both at the county level, the local level, and the state level. And we have worked forward to require all different forms of ID, whether they're student IDs, and created mechanisms where somebody can come to the polling place with an ID and a different address. And we just do things that way. But what we have gotten away from is the affidavit process. And the reason we have gotten away from it is we have found through a volunteer voting by an excessive, we have found that there has never been any mechanism to check a absentee ballot after it's been submitted to whichever district it is. Now, this would require the absentee ballot process to come back, or the affidavit process to come back into place, correct?
That would be my understanding, yes.
And and this might be a little change, but it's really important to the voters in North Dakota. So we start our early voting process, I think for military deployed overseas, it's as early as August. And we have, as I said, no excuse absentee ballots. But what we require is that our ballots are postmarked the day before the election. And in North Dakota, we really, really try to make sure the election is over on election day. North Dakotans don't understand how an election can change by 12, 13, 14,000 votes in the 2 to 3 weeks after an election day. Now, I'm not in the business of telling people in California or somewhere else how to do their voting laws, but that just is something that is not appropriate here. And this would require ballots to be postmarked up until election day, correct?
That's correct.
So when we are implementing laws at the federal level to deal with perceived or real problems in other areas of the country, I think we run into serious concerns about particularly rural districts who deal with these issues. Right now in our state legislature, we have a bill moving in place where county auditors and state legislators are dealing with voting precincts in particular counties, and it's a very unique North Dakota problem. And I would just caution everybody here to remember that those issues and those challenges are better suited to be dealt with by the people who are closest to their communities in dealing with the issues we face. And when we deal with these laws at this level, we turn this into something that we can't control at our local level. And we have unique challenges in North Dakota that other people don't.
It's worth noting, Mr. Armstrong, that there actually are no federal elections. There are state elections for federal office, and you've made that point very well.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel. I wish Congressman Meadows were still here because I'm delighted that he's thinking of stepping into the small donor matching system that is proposed in H.R. 1. Because when you step into that system, you step into a system that is owned by the people. This is why it's in the bill. Because the public is tired of feeling like their elections, their system, their government, their democracy is owned by special interests, big corporations, Wall Street, oil and gas industry, super PACs, lobbyists, everybody but them. This is the power move. They want to own their democracy again. And all across the country, as you pointed out, citizens are stepping up and taking that power back by creating these systems where they're the owners, the rightful owners of their own democracy. And they can get that back, Mr. Mirbani, I think you said, for $1 a year. $1 a year.
That's right.
Per citizen. To ransom your democracy back from the people who've taken it hostage so you can call the shots. So I would love for Congressman Meadows to step into that system. I'd like every member. It's a voluntary system. You don't have to do it. But I'd like every person to step into that system because that's owned by the people. That's the whole idea. People are sick and tired of being sick and tired, to use Fannie Lou Hamer's words, at a system that is run by somebody else. So that's the argument for that system. Now let me get to a couple of the other things that have been mentioned here in the 3 minutes and 15 seconds that I have. Somebody said at the outset that this was theater. I think the ranking member said maybe it was theater. This is not theater. We're trying to set the table on the democracy, make people feel more empowered, like their voice counts and they're not locked out and left out of their own democracy and their own government and their own republic. That's why we're doing this. Somebody said, why are we hooking all these things together? Voting, ethics, campaign finance. Because the people have told us, if you just do one and you don't do the others, we're still frozen out, the system's still rigged. You fix the voting stuff, but if you go to Washington and nobody's behaving themselves, that doesn't solve the problem. Or you fix the ethics part, but the system is still owned by the big money and the special interests because they're the ones that are underwriting the campaigns, then we're still left out. The system is still rigged. You got to do all of these things together to reset the democracy in a place where it respects the average citizen out there, who right now is sitting in their kitchen, they're looking at the TV screen, they're hearing about billionaires and super PACs who are making decisions inside conference rooms somewhere on K Street that affect their lives. And all they're saying is, we want back in. We're tired of sitting out here with our noses pressed against the window, looking in on the democracy that we have no impact on. That's why we're linking all of these things together, to reset the table, so the special interests aren't the ones that are calling the shots. Is voter fraud the problem? Mr. Smith would think would have you think so. Voter fraud is not the problem. We know the statistics on voter fraud. They're microscopic. Voter suppression is the problem. The obstacle course that has been set up that makes it so difficult for people to register and get to the polls, and that it demoralizes them, and they stay home. It's not worth it. We have to fix that, as Congressman Cummings said. That's the baseline. The most powerful form of protest and engagement an American citizen has is the right to vote. But too many people in too many parts of this country still can't get to the ballot box. That's all it's about. Coordination, violating free speech. We can have sensible coordination rules so that super PACs aren't coordinating with candidates and violating, the campaign contribution limits and so forth. We can do that. We can protect free speech while actually giving more speech back to people who are denied it right now. That's not a problem. We're not outing donors. The provisions of transparency in this bill are targeted to mega donors who give more than $10,000, who right now are hidden behind this Russian doll kind of structure where you can't see who it is. Who's behind the curtain? Who's putting all this money into campaigns? The public wants to know that. That's reasonable. Let them see what's happening to their own democracy and give them their power back. That's what H.R. 1 is, for the people.
Mr. Chairman.
That's how we designed it. I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, because Mr. Sarbanes specifically referenced something and said that I said this in a very loud voice. I have not addressed the question of voter fraud. That's not what the Institute for Free Speech does, and I just want to make that clear, that he's imputed to me comments that I did not make.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Grothman from Wisconsin.
A few questions. I'll start out with Mr. Smith again, since he's all warmed up. H.R. 1's a big bill, and takes a lot of time to go through it. Do you think the public will be able to read and understand how this bill affects their ability to participate in political discourse?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the operative verb in that question. What was it?
Do you believe members of the public will be able to read and understand?
I don't think they would have the faintest idea. And again, one of the problems anytime I think you put together a 570-page sort of omnibus bill is that it becomes very hard for people to grasp what it is that's going on, including, I would just expect, members.
Do you think more careful drafting could have solved that problem?
Well, I think that splitting the bill up would allow it to be considered in its component parts, and people might decide some parts are worth keeping and some are not. I do think there was a certain amount of carelessness in drafting, or again, perhaps some disingenuity. I mean, when you have a section titled Preventing Super PAC Candidate Coordination that applies to every citizen in the United States, not just super PACs, that seems to be some kind of drafting problem.
Okay. Just a general question. I can't tell you, probably the most powerful special interest in every election is the media. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'm told, you know, you can do this, or you can't do that, because this is the way it's going to be spun in the newspapers or spun on TV. I don't have an answer to this question, but when I look, there's a study that shows that when you look at like journalism, communication, tenure track professors, 20 Democrats for every one tenured track position. And it just dominates this building as people try to form their press releases or statements not to get in trouble with the media. Do any of you have any suggestions as to what we can do, or is it just something we're always going to have to deal with, a situation in which apparently 95% of the professors, tenure track professors in journalism and communications, where the people who, you know, determine how what we do here is reported are Democrat in nature? Does anybody have any? Would you agree with me that it's hard to have fair elections as long as that happens? And is there anything we can do about it?
It's clear, I'll go ahead and take the first stab at it. It's clear that the media has a tremendous amount of influence in elections, and they remain largely unregulated by this. And I'm not sure that you decrease that influence by putting limits on what groups of people can say and what citizens, you know, in the country operating through the groups they join can say and do. I will personally say that I've often said in the context of elections, is the current system perfect? Is it perfect to have a system in which people are relatively free to participate and give money? Well, it's not perfect, but as Churchill once said, it seems to be better than all of the alternatives. And that's somewhat true here as well. As much as the biased media may be a problem, the alternatives are probably not better. And I think this is something that each side would do very well to remember from time to time, that the world is not perfect and we're not going to have perfect elections. We try to do the best elections we can. And for most of our history, that has meant entirely unregulated elections. And I don't think we've much to show for the last 40 years of very heavy regulation.
I agree with you. The government shouldn't be weighing in on regulating what people can say or what type of people are hired. But given that I assume the majority of these tenure track people work for public universities, I just wondered if there's, I mean, a lot of people feel there's an unfairness out of there, you know, that you have to overcome not only your opponent, but the mainstream media. No suggestions as to how to deal with it. Okay, I'll go to something else, and people always ask me why we don't talk about this. The influence of money in elections. During the last administration, we had a situation in which the Secretary of State's husband was paid $500,000 on a speech in Russia. And, you know, I don't think there's any question if the Secretary of State herself had accepted $500,000. But do you think that we should begin to regulate the size of checks people are getting from spouses of relevant figures? Would that cause people to have more confidence in what goes on?
Well, I always think the detail is, or the devil is in the details, but I will say that too often the response has been to put limits on the American people, you know, rather than say maybe the limit should be on the people who are actually serving in government, including their families having to give something up.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up is the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a great segue. Mr. Smith just suggested that maybe the families of people in government should have some restriction on their income. And I'd like to draw attention to Mr. Schwab, who has been of great service to our country, and to all of you for your presentations here today. But Ivanka Trump, who last I noted was the daughter of the President of the United States, has businesses. And she was granted 34 trademarks in China after her father was elected, and she became a member of the administration. These trademarks were granted during a period of economic tension between the United States and China and coincided with the Trump administration's lifting a ban on U.S. sales of technology to Chinese firm ZTE, which violated U.S. sanctions with illegal sales to Iran. Mr. Schwab, what are the risks to the American people about these kinds of conflicts of interest?
Well, I think these and all conflicts of interest create the risk of a divided loyalty. The American people ought to be able to have confidence that their leaders in Washington are serving their best interests and not their own personal financial interests. I think the situation got worse when the president departed from past traditional interpretation of the nepotism law, which for 50 years, and at least, I believe, 4 OLC pieces of guidance had told presidents they couldn't do that. And the consequence has been that she's been allowed by the White House to retain the types of assets that even this White House is not allowing other people other than her husband to retain.
So strengthening the anti-nepotism laws would be a key component if we're trying to clean up the mess that is in the White House right now.
I absolutely think so.
All right, thank you. Mrs. Flynn, I serve on the Intelligence Committee, and I'm deeply troubled at what appears to be Russian engagement through 501c4s in this country, whether it's the NRA or other nonprofits that are created for the express purpose here in the United States to lobby on behalf of Russia as it related to the Magnitsky Act. So right now, there is no limitation on how much money can be contributed by a foreign government entity to a 501c4. Is that correct?
I believe that is, yes.
And there is no disclosure required as well. Is that correct?
I believe that's right.
So in your estimation, would it be prudent for us to, one, limit the amount of contributions that a foreign individual can make to a 501c4, and two, that all of that be subject to disclosure?
Yeah, I think it would be very important. There are limits, there are bans on foreign nationals giving money in campaign contributions, and I think we should be looking at those kind of limits for, and it's certainly disclosure for contributions to 501c4s.
There are 4 cabinet officials in this administration, the Secretaries of Health and Human Services, Veterans Affairs, Interior, and the EPA Administrator, who have all resigned, admit evidence that they had forced American taxpayers to foot the bill for extravagant and unnecessary travel expenses. And I would like to ask Mr. Mirbani if you can speak to the impact these resignations have had on the ability of the executive branch agencies to function effectively, and how we can relieve ourselves of the abuse that some of these secretaries of various cabinet posts were engaged in.
Thank you. I'm going to refer back to something that I think multiple members of this panel said earlier, which is that leadership on ethics issues really sets the tone, from my experience, for the rest of staff at an agency. And that leadership should actually be coming from the White House. And there have been multiple practices spanning multiple decades by Republican and Democratic administrations and presidents that have done just that to make sure that they are avoiding even the perception of a conflict of interest or using their position for private gain. That's a bedrock principle in our democracy. And the bill, the H.R. 1, enshrines many of these practices into law, and I think would serve as a good first step for preventing some of what we've seen over the last couple of years.
I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Higgins from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of bipartisanship, let me say I agree that H.R. 1 should be divided into its component parts, because perhaps it could be argued that there's some worthwhile legislation written in here, but as a totality of circumstance, one word describes this thing: wrong. Just wrong. This bill is exactly reflective of why our founding fathers passionately debated after the Revolutionary War, prior to the formation of our Federalist Society and central government. They passionately debated whether or not this thing could even work, if we could have a federalist society and a union of states with a strong central government and still maintain individual rights and freedoms. My colleague across the aisle mentioned Russia. Russia has been mentioned several times today. This bill resembles Russian government policy. Most of us here have taken an oath before we became congressmen and congresswomen. I took an oath as an Army soldier. I took oaths as a police officer, a sheriff's deputy. You panelists before us are courageous to come before this committee, where many very serious decisions will be made. Debates shall be engaged. But most of you have taken an oath as well. And may I say that the oaths that I took in my life were not to a company commander or a general or a sheriff or a chief or a marshal. They were to the constitutionalist principles that my oath represented. Mr. Smith, does our First Amendment protect freedom of speech?
I think that goes without saying.
Does H.R. 1 abridge the freedom of speech?
Pardon? Pardon, I didn't hear that.
Would you agree that H.R. 1 abridges the freedom of speech?
Yes.
Absolutely. Gives almost total partisan government control over the freedom of political speech in a representative republic where these freedoms have been paid for by the blood of patriots past. Are we worthy to be the Americans that occupy this body? Did our founders intend, Mr. Smith, for there to be an expiration date on our First Amendment rights? Any panelist?
No.
Of course not. That expiration date will come if H.R. 1 passes. Mr. Smith, I'd like to ask you, according to the tone that my colleagues have expressed here, Americans watching this would think that they stand for the abolishment of big money in political campaigns. According to my research, the Association of Trial Lawyers gave Democrat candidates in 2018 $2.2 million, while they gave Republican candidates about $130,000. This is not a bill of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's a bill of trial lawyers, for trial lawyers, and by trial lawyers. It greatly restricts the freedoms of speech of Americans assembled as nonprofit organizations or individual citizens. It hides behind titles that are quite misleading in an era when we know that many Americans that have the right to vote, yes, but don't get past headlines. I'd like to specifically ask in my time remaining, Mr. Smith, for you to address. Explain to us all, please, what coordinated spenders are. This is quite troubling to me. I've read your testimony and those of your colleagues, the panelists. Incorporated nonprofits defined as coordinated speakers would be banned from spending money on speech. This is directly contrary to judicial decisions passed. Please, remaining my time, 40 seconds, explain to America what that is.
In my prepared remarks, I have a number of examples, and the way this works is, of course, most groups that people belong to, the ACLU, the NRA, Right to Life, Planned Parenthood, the NAACP, are incorporated, and if corporations can't make any coordinated expenditures because those are treated as contributions. And so just to give some examples, if a member were to purchase a ticket to a fundraiser for one of these organizations for $100 or $150, and 5 years later, that member declared his candidacy for the Senate, that organization could not make any expenditures, not only directly advocating his election or defeat, but even talking about the candidate in ways that might be deemed by someone to be.
In my remaining 5 seconds, yes or no, would this have a chilling effect on the freedom of speech of Americans assembled from sea to shining sea?
Absolutely.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Thank you for taking your allotted time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. This is a fascinating conversation. I want to thank Mr. Sarbanes for his leadership on this. He's put incredible hours into it, and I appreciate it. I have seen him in action across the country, talking to electeds of both parties. What this really is about is power. Ms. Hobert Flynn in 1970, when John Gardner started your organization, a Republican who served a Democratic administration, It was about power then, it's about power now, and we've grown. Clearly, there is growing research that says that Congress does not reflect the average person, and it reflects more people who contribute and have influence on both sides. For my opinion and many others, that has contributed significantly to our income inequality and a lack of opportunity, particularly for younger people. Would you address sort of the historical perspective from Common Cause and John Gardner's admonition, which is your call, holding power accountable over time?
Yes, thank you. You know, the challenge here is that what we're talking about is the ability of wealthy interest to speak louder than the rest of the American people. And that's what we object to. What we are doing is not actually putting in place anything that violates anybody's freedom of speech. We're talking about simple things like disclosure, a voluntary system of small donor reform. Candidates do not have to participate, and the fact is, you know, how this will be funded depends on the system. In Connecticut, they used unclaimed assets to fund the public financing system. The difference is that people who are not wealthy and not connected to special interests can run for office. They have a competitive chance. They don't have to be connected to wealthy interests. And then once elected, they are free to serve based on what their constituents want, and they don't have wealthy interests coming up and saying, hey, this is what I need you to do, I need this tax break or something else. It frees them. And so what you see in those kinds of systems is that people govern differently. I saw a palatable difference with lobbyists who were treated by freshmen who ran under the program. They didn't think they were powerful. They treated them, you can tell me information, but you have no control, no monetary control. And so they can enact what is best in the best interest of their citizens. Those are the kinds of things we need to look at. A comprehensive approach also deals with ethics. So you may have this system set up that people can choose to run in or not. But if in the end they're taking money through the back door in gifts and money that goes to their businesses, they still could have corruption problems. So you need to look more broadly at these issues. You also need not only to lift the voice of small donors, but lift the voice of all Americans so that they can vote and have a voice in their democracy. And so that's why you see these voting measures that are so incredibly important to make it easier. And actually, it ends up saving money when you move to online voter registration. There are checks in place so that you're not capturing illegal immigrants in voting. So what we want to see is a chance to have, you know, independent agencies. And the Federal Election Commission is one that's flawed, that has not worked, and you've had Republicans block enforcement of the law. We need agencies that enforce the law with integrity. And so you can have things like blue ribbon commissions, like they talk about in this bill. There are other models to look at in Wisconsin with the Government Accountability Board, in Connecticut with bipartisan and independents involved. So it is a holistic approach to try and ensure that people's voices are heard in our democracy.
And just editorial comment, I'm constantly reminded as a former history major, the history around us when Teddy Roosevelt talked about the malefactors of great wealth and the influence of trusts in the Congress, and what that led to is the inequality that we now rival at this point in time. Mr. Schwab, just briefly, could you elaborate on your on the positive aspects of making your former position directly be able to respond to report to Congress, and some trouble we have had with OGE getting written responses that both the Republicans and Democrats have been frustrated by?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that OGE's two sister agencies, the Merit Systems Protection Board and the Office of Special Counsel, can communicate directly with Congress, but OGE has to go through the political approval process through the White House's Office of Management and Budget, which means that OGE doesn't have the ability to alert Congress of problems or give them answers to the information they're seeking. And we've seen inspectors general and those other two agencies I've mentioned use this ability to great effect to protect the government's integrity.
Thank you. Yield the remainder of my time. Our next speaker is Mr. Gibbs from Texas.
Thank you.
Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio, I was going to say.
Yeah.
Texas is a great state, though.
It's hard to miss. As is
thank
Ohio.
you. Thank you for our witnesses. First of all, I want to say on Ohio, I think the process is working pretty good. I know Ms. Flynn talked about long lines. A number of years ago in the United States Senate, we passed some legislation, no excuse absentee ballots. Voting, you can get 30 days before the election. A lot of people are doing that. You don't, so there's we don't have lines anymore, and we don't need a federal holiday, so you can go vote. You got 30 days to go vote. If you can't vote in 30 days by mail or by absentee, that just raises a lot of interesting questions about your voting, your abilities. Also in Ohio, the Secretary of State, the practice has been to send out 2 or 3 weeks before absentee ballots will be mailed out to every registered voter in Ohio, saying, hey, if you want to let us know, here's an application for an absentee ballot, send it in, we'll send you an absentee ballot. Pretty simple. So Mr. Smith, going through, I got some questions here. My understanding that that this bill authorizes a 3-judge panel here in the U.S. District Court in District of Columbia to redraw congressional districts in the states. Is that in the bill?
I believe that's correct, but again, that's outside of the area that I'm most focused on.
Okay. It's just bizarre that we have federalism and states' rights, that we'd have a 3-judge panel here in Washington, D.C., a one-size-fits-all for all the rest of the 50 states. So that's a big problem with the bill. As we've had this discussion that authorizes federal employees to poll workers and pay them and all that, we obviously don't need that in Ohio. We have a good system, a bipartisan system. Every county board has 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and every precinct that the poll workers, it's 50-50, bipartisan. When they count the ballots, it's all bipartisan, and that's probably why you haven't heard a lot of problems in Ohio, like other states. It's also interesting what we saw, what the IRS did a few years ago targeting conservative groups. Mr. Smith, do you think that this bill would actually open up a can of worms give more empowerment to bureaucrats here in Washington, D.C., where we can see abuse of that type, nature?
We often say, the purpose of disclosure is for the people to monitor their government, but it's not for the government to monitor their people. And this gives a lot more information to government, and a lot of it is intended, opens up the possibility of that sort of retaliation, or alternatively, the online harassment and so on that private individuals can engage in.
I appreciate that.
That's a long way of saying yes.
Yeah, I got that. Also, in the bill was talked up by my colleague, Mr. Meadows from North Carolina, the 6-to-1 payment of federal taxpayer dollars. So if you have a $200 contribution, you get $1,200 taxpayer dollars. I don't see how that is a good thing. Where in the Constitution or anywhere it says that I could be a taxpayer and I don't want my money going to my opponent, say, my tax dollars. So it's a big fundamental problem with that. I have major concerns, and I think that opens up a can of worms that's be really a huge problem. I also wanted to ask, we hear so much attack on political action committees, PACs. Mr. Smith, maybe the best one to answer this, I don't know, maybe anybody wants to answer it. Where do political action committees get their money?
Political action committees get their money from individuals. Traditional PACs do. Now, super PACs, as they're called, can take money from corporations and unions, but they are not able to contribute directly to candidates or to coordinate anything with candidates.
I appreciate that. Make the point, because I got attacked because I take political action money, but it comes from businesses in my district, a lot of it. It comes from associations. Everybody has somebody lobbying for them in D.C. I mean, if you're a member of a retirement association, any organization, you got a lobbyist here.
And to be more precise, if I can interrupt, Congressman, it actually comes from the involuntary contributions from the employees of those businesses and trade associations.
That's absolutely right. Unlike another entity on the labor side, it's not voluntary. And so that's a point I think is really important and needs to be made, that this money is coming, that people voluntarily support. They could be insurance agents supporting the company they work for. They could be members of a farm organization. supporting what the organization is out there advocating for, and they support that. If they didn't support it, they wouldn't give the money because it's voluntary. So this attack on this, and then they put the provision in this bill, if you take political action, I believe it's in the bill, you don't get the 6-to-1 match. I believe that's correct in the bill. So it's definitely a partisan bill and targeted for their partisan activities. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So let's play a game. Let's play a lightning round game. I'm going to be the bad guy, which I'm sure half the room would agree with anyway. And I want to get away with as much bad things as possible, ideally to enrich myself and advance my interest, even if that means putting my interests ahead of the American people. So, Mrs. Hobert Flynn. Oh, and by the way, I have enlisted all of you as my co-conspirators. So you're going to help me legally get away with all of this. So, Mrs. Hobert Flynn, I want to run. If I want to run a campaign that is entirely funded by corporate political action committees, is there anything that legally prevents me from doing that?
No.
Okay, so there's nothing stopping me from being entirely funded by corporate PACs, say from the fossil fuel industry, the healthcare industry, big pharma. I'm entirely 100% lobbyist PAC funded. Okay, so let's say I'm a really, really bad guy, and let's say I have some skeletons in my closet that I need to cover up so that I can get elected. Mr. Smith, is it true that you wrote this article, this opinion piece for the Washington Post entitled, "These payments to women were unseemly, that doesn't mean they were illegal"?
Well, I can't see the piece, but I wrote a piece under that headline in the Post, so I assume that's right.
Okay, great. So, green light for hush money. I can do all sorts of terrible things. It's totally legal right now for me to pay people off. And that is considered speech. That money is considered speech. So I use my special interest dark money funded campaign to pay off folks that I need to pay off and get elected. So now I'm elected, now I'm in. I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Fabulous. Now, is there any hard limit that I have, perhaps Mrs. Hobert Flynn, is there any hard limit that I have in terms of what legislation I'm allowed to touch? Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence, especially if I'm based on the special interest funds that I accepted to finance my campaign and get me elected in the first place?
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by oil and gas. I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Okay, so awesome. Now, Mr. Mirabani, the last thing I want to do is get rich with as little work possible. That's really what I'm trying to do as the bad guy, right? So is there anything preventing me from holding stocks, say, in an oil or gas company, and then writing laws to deregulate that industry and cause, that could potentially cause the stock value to soar and accrue a lot of money in that time?
You could do that.
So I could do that. I could do that now with the way our current laws are set up. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so my last question is, or one of my last questions, I guess I'd say, is it possible that any elements of this story apply to our current government and our current public servants right now?
Yes.
Yes.
So we have a system that is fundamentally broken. We have these influences existing in this body, which means that these influences are here in this committee shaping the questions that are being asked of you all right now. Would you say that that's correct,
Yes.
Mr. Mirabani or Mr. Schwab?
Yes.
All right, so one last thing, Mr. Schwab. In relation to congressional oversight that we have, the limits that are placed on me as a congresswoman, compared to the executive branch and compared to, say, the President of the United States, would you say that Congress has the same sort of standard of accountability? Is there more teeth in that regulation in Congress on the President, or would you say it's about even, or more so on the federal?
In terms of laws that apply to the president, yeah, there's just almost no laws at all that apply to the president.
So I'm being held, and every person in this body is being held to a higher ethical standard than the President of the United States.
That's right, because there are some ethics committee rules that apply to you.
And it's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Roy of Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Smith, I wondered if you might have any comments on the questioning by my colleague from New York. You seem to have a few notes you're writing down. Anything you want to say after that discussion?
Well, I would say there are a couple things, for example, that would not be. She answers, is there anything that you know, could apply here? There are certain things that could not apply here. For example, the whole point of the article that she held up that I wrote was that you cannot use your campaign funds to make those kinds of payments. That would be illegal personal use. Campaign funds are not dark money. They are totally disclosed, so they are not dark money. It's worth noting, by the way, that earlier it was mentioned that dark money constituted about $1.7 billion. I believe that figure is incorrect by a factor of about 500%. Dark money constitutes about 2 to 4% of the total spending in U.S. elections and has always been involved in U.S. elections. So those are just a couple of points. And I did kind of chuckle at the question, is it possible, asked of us, that these influences this money is influencing the questioning here? To that, I'd say that's something you have to ask yourselves if you're being influenced and see what you think. If you are, you might question yourselves. If you're not, you might question this hearing.
A couple of questions about super PACs, as they are often referred to. Are federal candidates allowed to coordinate directly with a super PAC and or have anything to do legally with its formation?
No, they are not at the current time, no.
With respect to super PACs, is this a particularly partisan problem, or would you say both parties have super PACs funding elections and funding candidacies?
Both do, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on this. I believe historically they've leaned more Republican, but in the last election cycle leaned more Democratic. I'm not 100% sure of that, but it's certainly a bipartisan issue.
So if we deploy the famous "let me Google that for you," and we got this to come up to say, well, a bunch of headlines, and you Google it to say, Democrat super PAC spending $3 million from Menendez in New Jersey, super PAC money dominated 2018 election in Colorado, and Democrats controlled in the cash race. Democratic super PAC translates ads to Spanish after seeing election day search trends. And if we went through and through and through, we would see that this is not a particularly partisan question or problem. It's just a baseline. Is that right, Mr. Smith?
I think that's right.
And when we think about what we're dealing with respect to campaign finance, are you familiar with doxing?
In the sense of outing people online, that's what you're referring to, yes, generally.
So, for example, are you familiar with a Twitter account called Every Trump Donor?
No,
which
I'm not.
Tweeted out one by one the names, hometowns, occupations, employers, people who contributed as little as $200 to the president's campaign, each tweet following a particular formula. My point being, and the question for you is, when we talk about campaign disclosures, are we aware of the negative impacts that you have on forcing American citizens in exercising their free speech to have that information be disclosed? Whether that's good policy or not might be debatable, but are there negative consequences to that with respect to free speech, given you're an expert on free speech?
There are, and there are definitely studies that have shown that disclosure does tend to decrease participation. Now, that doesn't mean, as you point out, that it's not worth it, but it certainly has cost. And so we have to be careful in how broad we let that disclosure become.
Thank you. Mrs. Hobert Flynn, just a quick question. Did I hear correctly earlier in one of your exchanges with one of my colleagues here that you consider proof of citizenship as one of the barriers to voting or one of the obstacles for people to be able to vote, a proof of citizenship? Is that one of the ones you outlined?
Yes, that it's appeared, it is used, at many polling places that people just attest to that. To have to come up with the paperwork is a burden for many Americans.
As well as you outlined photo ID, early voting changes, if you're restricting early voting from being longer, shorter, and election day registration. That's the position. And the reason I ask is because when we look at obstacles to voting, we know that the Voting Rights Act was a paramount piece of legislation to ensure people have access to the polls. We also know that the Voting Rights Act ran into constitutional problems in Shelby County versus Holder for very good reason. If you look at what the majority wrote, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 employed extraordinary measures to address an extraordinary problem. In the face of unremitting and ingenious defiance of citizens' constitutionally protected right to vote, Section 5 was necessary to give effect to the 15th Amendment in particular regions of the country. This is South Carolina v. Katzenbach. And today, this is now Justice Thomas writing in a concurrence, today our nation has changed. The conditions that originally justified Section 5 are no longer characterized voting in the covered jurisdictions. Mr. Smith, are you aware that in this legislation, there's an attempt to bring Section 5 back with respect to preclearance? And could you comment at all on that and what that might mean?
As we're out of time, I'll just note that yes, that is true, and I think the Supreme Court's concern was that the formula applied from data from 1964 and simply needed to be updated to reflect modern realities, and this bill, I don't believe, makes any effort to do that.
That is correct. Thank you.
Congresswoman Presley of Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very interesting hearing. Charges of radicalism, accusations of motives of partisanship, but never a peep or outrage about partisan gerrymandering, which has benefited your party for decades. That is really convenient and rich and hypocritical. H.R. 1 has been described as a wish list by the Democrats. Well, you've got us there. A wish list for an inclusive, expanded democracy and electorate. Characterizations of H.R. 1 as a power grab. You got us again, guilty. We wouldn't have to grab back the power for the people if through policy you weren't complicit in or perpetuating the disenfranchisement and marginalization of the people, and disproportionately people of color, and disproportionately black people. Representative John Lewis reminds us that if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't work so hard to take it from you. This is the House of Representatives. We are sent here as representatives of our districts and a greater democracy. And at the core of democracy and the root word of demos is to engage more voices, and to empower them in this democracy. I am really at a loss for words. I am embarrassed and hurt by the dog whistles, by the vitriol and the venom in this space, and the smugness. It is stunning and unconscionable. Disappointment and outrage about a federal holiday for Election Day, early voting and mail-in voting, the rights of formerly incarcerated restored. According to the Sentencing Project, 6.1 million Americans have lost their right to vote due to felony disenfranchisement laws that disproportionately impact communities of color. Ms. Flynn, the United States ranks 26 among the lowest of all established democracies around the world in voter turnout. Certainly belies characterizations of American exceptionalism. Could you speak to the passage of H.R. 1 and the establishment of a federal voting holiday, how this would help to broaden turnout, particularly for voters who have historically been disenfranchised? Could you also speak to how many developed countries follow this practice and how it has impacted their turnout?
Yes, I apologize, I do not have information, but I will share it with the committee about other countries. But I will say that a federal holiday can make a huge difference for many Americans who cannot afford to take a day off of work to get to the polls, or as we have seen Common Cause and the Lawyers Committee and many other voting rights groups do election protection during the election season. And we saw long lines in states across the country. We had machines that were breaking down or switching votes. We had machines that did not work, and so people had long lines. Many people cannot afford to wait in line for 3, 4, 5 hours at a polling place, many have to get back to work.
Thank
So a federal holiday would make a big difference.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amey, so we've spoken a great deal about lobbying corruption. I'd like to speak about the corruption of contractors. Mr. Amey, in your written testimony, you discussed the crisis of the rampant revolving door, where ranking officials commonly enter cushy jobs for the very contractors they were charged with overseeing on behalf of taxpayers. Last year, your organization issued an investigative report that Tracy Valero, a former senior official for ICE, less than 3 months after leaving government service, she was hired by the GEO Group, ICE's largest single private prison and detention center, which brought in more than $327 million in the last year alone. She even served as an expert witness for the company in a lawsuit that alleged violations of minimum wage laws and other inhumane treatment of immigrant detainees. Mr. Amey, in your expert opinion, is it ethical for a senior government contracting office to go work for the very entity she was overseeing just months before?
The quick answer is no, and that's where the law is created that has cooling off periods. And so there's no cooling off period, a 1 year, a 2 year, or permanent bans. H.R. 1 would move a lot of those to 2 years, I think, which would be beneficial. And there's even disagreement in our community whether 1 year or 2, what is the appropriate time to kind of cool off so that your contacts aren't there. But this is also something that President Trump brought up. When he was a candidate, he talked about, I think it was Boeing at the time, but he went on record saying that people who give contracts should never be able to work for that defense contractor. This is a bipartisan issue. This is something we can resolve. The laws are already on the books. We just need some extensions and some tweaking of those to improve them and allow people to cool off and not be able to provide a competitive advantage to their new employer or favor them as they're in office and they're walking out the door.
And so you do believe that extending this cooling off period and strengthening these prohibitions would protect the integrity of the process and help to rein in these flagrant abuses? 100%,
and one of the nice things with H.R. 1 is there is an extension of a cooling off period for people coming into government service. Currently it exists and it's 1 year. This will move it to 2, and I think that's a probably better place to be, that you shouldn't be handling issues that involve your former employer or clients.
One final question. How might these cozy relationships between government officials and corporate leaders or private contractors help to boost profits for these prison and detention centers?
Well, certainly they go with a lot of information when they go over to the private sector, but it also allows them to get back into their former office and within their former agency and call on them. Access, as you were just pointing out, access is everything in this town. And so if you can get your phone calls answered, if you can get emails read, if you get meetings, at that point that can, not only with members of Congress, but with agency heads, that can determine who gets contracts. I mean, it does trickle down from the top, and we need to make sure that we prevent as many like actual and also appearances of conflicts of interest we can.
Thank you so much. I yield.
Sorry, this is my first time up here. I'd like to recognize Mrs. Miller from West Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. To all of you, thank you so much for being here today. Mr. Smith, in your testimony, you discussed the language utilized by groups that mention either federal candidates or elected officials, which promotes, attacks, supports, or opposes, otherwise known as PASO. It is my understanding that H.R. 1 uses this highly subjective qualifier as a standard for all communications. With that in mind, given the broad use of PASO in H.R. 1, what kind of chilling effect do you believe this will have on free speech in our country?
Well, I think it will have a substantial chilling effect, and I think that's why the Supreme Court, in a number of opinions dating back for almost a half a century, has said that the standards used to regulate speech have to be clear and closely tied to elections, that this kind of vague standard does not work. For a long time, it used a standard of express advocacy. You had to say vote for, vote against, support, defeat. Later, the court expanded that a little bit to anything that was susceptible of no other reasonable meaning than a request to vote for a candidate, and even then only if it aired within 60 days of an election. So I think this kind of broad standard is almost certainly unconstitutional, and it's unconstitutional precisely because it chills so much speech that goes outside of efforts to elect candidates, our ability just to talk about issues and civic affairs.
Well, that pretty much leads into my second question, which was what impact would the passage of this legislation have on those groups that are not political but may put out policy-oriented communications?
It would be very serious, and I've given a number of examples in the written testimony. I just say that I should add to this, of course, that the bill includes personal liability for officers and directors of some of these organizations. So you'd almost have to be crazy to let your organization get anywhere close to this promote, support, attack, oppose standard. And again, what does that mean? As I suggested, again, a government union might take out an ad maybe in a month, right, or 3 weeks from now saying, don't let President Trump, we shouldn't have to pay because he wants his wall in Mexico, so tell him to reopen the government. Is that an attack on President Trump? I think that's the kind of thing that folks would not know and would make people very hesitant to run that kind of ad.
So it is a personal risk as well.
Yes. Yes, not only a risk. Plus, it would be a risk, by the way, as well to the tax status of some of the organizations involved. Many of these organizations might have some type of tax status. 501c3 organizations would have to be very careful because if they engage in speech that is now defined as political speech, 501c3 organizations can't engage in political speech. They would jeopardize their tax-exempt status. So that's another reason that these organizations would stay far clear of commenting on any kind of public issue.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Will the gentlewoman yield?
I yield to, wait, who asked that?
Carol.
Yes, I yield.
I thank the chairman. I thank the chairman. I want to come in and actually, Ms. Flynn, want to come to you briefly. You're a nonpartisan group, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
All right, Mr. Schwab, you are here representing Crew, is that correct?
Yes.
You're a nonpartisan group?
Yes.
So is there anything to be learned by your board members and who they contribute to? Because you say you're nonpartisan, yet, Mr. Schwab, if I look at all your board and who they contribute to, I think the lone donation to a Republican was $250 to John McCain, but yet hundreds of thousands of dollars from your board members to all kinds of Democrat operatives and causes across the way. So is there anything to be drawn from your board supporting those causes to suggest that you're partisan or not?
No. No, and
all right.
and they don't.
So I'm confused a little bit, Mr. Schwab. If we can't draw that conclusion, then how in the world can we draw conclusions about other related entities in the government based on their association or lack thereof of other individuals?
Entities in the government?
Yeah. I mean, you're making all kinds of accusations that, with the chairwoman's permission, let me finish the one question very quickly. So in that, your board is inherently left-leaning based on their political contributions. And you're saying that that has no input or direction on what your organization stands for. Is that your sworn testimony here today?
It's a nonpartisan group, yes.
All right, I yield back.
Mr. Conniff from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank John Sarbanes and Chairman Cummings for their leadership. Mr. Smith, you're a student of history, I can tell. So I want to read you a quote and see if you can guess which president said this. "It is well to provide that corporations shall not contribute to presidential or national campaigns, and furthermore to provide the publication of both contributions and expenditures. However, no such law would hamper an unscrupulous man of unlimited means from buying his way into office. There is a very radical measure which would, I believe, work a substantial improvement in our system of conducting a campaign, although I'm well aware that it will take some time for people so to familiarize themselves with such a proposal. The need for collecting large campaign funds would vanish if Congress provided an appropriation for the proper and legitimate expenses of campaigns." Campaigns was a paraphrase, but that's the point. Do you know who said that?
I believe that's Teddy Roosevelt.
It is Teddy Roosevelt. Do you disagree with Teddy Roosevelt?
Yes, I do.
Do you disagree with the establishment of the public funding for presidential campaigns?
I do think that has been ineffective and not a good idea. I also disagree with Ben Tillman, who sponsored the original Tillman Act for TR.
Did President Reagan participate under the presidential funding campaign?
Yes, he did.
Would you say that it's fair to say there were some strong conservatives elected under the presidential funding campaign?
Yes, there were.
I was struck by your statement that, quote, the subsidy will most likely drive donors away from moderating forces exerted by parties. Is it your view, and I mean, it's a legitimate view, there is a debate in democracy. My view is American people are really smart, great, and I trust the popular will. Is it your view that the donors, which are 5%, sort of have a elite, sort of Republican function to moderate the will of the American public?
No, my view is that the public is very smart too, which is why I trust them at the ballot box to make good decisions.
But why do you say, you don't say that the voters will have a moderating force. You're saying that the donors are going to have this moderating force. I just want to see what particular attributes do you give these donors? I mean, look, our founders, there were some founders who believed that there should be elites who put a check on the popular will, and I mean, it would be an honest view if you said people who give $2,700 or $5,400 that in your view they're smarter or better and that they need to have a check on Americans. I mean, my view is that Americans are very smart and I trust them more.
Well, it's not really necessary for you to put words in my mouth, Mr. Khanna. I did not say those things, but what I do think is the case is that there's empirical evidence that shows that small donors tend to be more polarized than large donors, and that's just a question of empirical evidence. Now, if you want to ignore the facts, you're free to do that, but that doesn't mean that donors or the public are stupid. Voters are very smart, and again, I trust them at the ballot box to make the right decision.
But why do you think that we need large donors to have an influence? I guess that's my question. I mean, you're basically saying they're 5% of the country. We can agree that have these large donors. You're saying they have a force for good in our democracy.
I don't think that we need them to play that role. I think that, on the other hand, the idea that we're going to benefit simply by trying to make sure that we do a 6-to-1 match for small donors is not going to have the results people think it will have.
I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying I'm trying to understand your view, because I think this is what drives a lot of the view. It's that they're fundamentally people who believe that these 5% of donors have some influence on our democracy that you say is less polarizing. I mean, what does that mean? Why is it that we can't?
That's not my view. My view is that it is generally a matter of bad policy and tremendous risk and a violation of the First Amendment to try to limit people's ability to speak out, to contribute to candidates, to join groups that engage in independent
you think that Theodore Roosevelt was violating the First Amendment as well?
I think he was incorrect, yeah.
But just on this moderation, I mean, forget the First Amendment argument. I want to understand the polarization argument. Why is it that you think 95% of the country needs to be moderated? I mean, what is it that, what is these large?
I don't think that. What I think and what the empirical evidence shows is that small donors, which are still a small percentage of the total country, tend to be more polarizing in their views and in their donations than are others. Ask yourself.
No, but if you have public financing, you wouldn't have large donors. Then is your only concern the First Amendment concern, or do you think that these large donors are playing some positive influence in our democracy?
I don't think they're playing a particularly positive influence. In some cases they are, by the way. In some cases they're not. I don't think as a group they're uniformly playing a positive role or a negative role, just as I don't think small donors are uniformly playing a positive role or a negative role, and I don't think every member of this committee is uniformly positive or negative. We're individuals. We play individual roles.
Thank you.
Recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Schwab, how long were you at OGE?
A total of just short of 14 years.
And how long were you the chairman?
Well, I was never a
director,
chairman.
excuse me.
Director, 4.5, I think.
4.5 years as director, and when did that end?
July 2017. I don't remember the exact.
So into the Trump administration, you still function as director for
That's
6 months,
right.
7 months. Okay. And tell me exactly how things work at OGE. Do you provide counsel and advice to folks in the executive branch of the government on ethical concerns they may have? Do they come to you, or do you go to them? How does it typically work?
It typically works, you're talking about the prevention mechanism. It typically works that the official initiates the interaction and comes seeking guidance for something that they want to do. or to find out if they, need to do something. The only other way where it comes involuntary is through the financial disclosure system, where they're required to file these reports. OGE reviews them and often works back and forth with them.
How did it work with the President of the United States? Did his lawyers come to you, or did you look at his financial disclosures, or both?
Yeah, they came to us. We had been working with them since, well, I'm not sure when he first became a candidate. It was...
His lawyers reached out to you at some point while he was candidate, and then continued to reach out to you while he was president-elect, and I assume while he was president.
That's right.
All three stages.
That's right.
Okay. And on November 30th, 2016, while it was then President-elect Trump, you did a series of tweets about your interactions with the president's legal team. Is that accurate? I got them right here. I'll read them if you want.
No. I'm trying. It's the characterization about their what?
Their interactions with OGE.
I believe they were about divestiture and about our encouraging them to divest.
Did you send them out on your official account?
My official? No, we sent them out on the Office of Government Ethics.
That's what I mean.
Account. Yes.
Right. You tweeted these out.
That's right.
Did you ever tweet out anything dealing with anyone else who had sought your counsel and advice?
We'd only had the account for about 3 years.
It's a yes or no
and
question.
I don't think we did.
So the only guy you ever tweeted about who you've been dealing with was the President-elect of the United States of America, right?
Yes.
You said things like this. We told your counsel we would sing your praises if you divested. We meant it. I mean, so you're tweeting out for the whole world private conversations you've had with someone who sought your advice, their legal counsel. You said, as we discussed with your counsel, divestiture is a way to resolve these conflicts. Then you did this one. OGE applauds the total, in parentheses, divestiture decision, mocking the president-elect.
No, we were not mocking.
Then why'd you put it in parentheses?
Because it was, I think, a quote.
And you said you had never done this before. Never tweeted out about anyone else in the executive branch who sought your advice and counsel on how they can deal with ethical issues. This was the only individual you ever tweeted out about.
I think it's a mischaracterization to describe it as confidential advice. OGE's position that a president should divest
I didn't say anything about confidential. All I said is this the only guy you ever tweeted about?
All right, I thought I heard you say confidential at one point.
I did not. Did you? And you said you did tweet about the president-elect, no one else.
That's right.
You find that unusual?
Do I find it? I find everything about the past 2.5 years unusual.
No, I'm not saying that. Do you find unusual that, what I'm saying is, well, let's say it this way. Do you think it was a professional decision that the guy who's ahead of the Office of Government Ethics, when you're going to give information to the public only about one individual, and you've never done it in your 14 years at OGE and 4 years as director?
Well, again, you said disclose information. I didn't share information. This was from 1983, was when OGE first
so what were you trying to convey?
What were you trying to convey in these?
What were you trying to convey in these tweets?
That the president should divest, as OGE had been saying.
Well, couldn't you just tell his lawyers?
1983. We did tell his lawyers.
Well, then why'd you tweet about it?
We had reached a dead end, and I wasn't convinced that our communications were reaching him.
You're talking to his lawyers. His lawyers reached out to you first. You're communicating to him the advice that you think is what they need to do, and yet you go tweet about it?
We were trying to nudge him toward divestiture. He had just issued a statement that he was going to achieve total, you have the phrase there. I don't have the phrase, and I don't want to say it wrong, but total.
OGE applauds the total divestiture decision. Bravo.
No, he said something like completely separate or completely resolve conflicts of interest. I don't want to claim I remember the quote exactly. And so what we were trying to do, we had two choices: interpret that as unclear, or give him, doubt him, or give him the benefit of the doubt that what he said was true. We made a decision to choose to take him at his exact literal words, because only divestiture.
You made a decision to tweet out conversations you had with the President-elect's counsel when they were seeking advice and guidance from you, and you had never, ever done that before.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I'd like to yield 2 minutes to Ms. Tlaib from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairwoman Hill. It's wonderful seeing you up there. I really appreciate this. At this very moment, I'm thinking about my teenage son who would be saying, we're talking about tweets right now, and he'd say, seriously? But I just really want to talk about something incredibly serious, which is the law of the land, the United States Constitution. We all have a duty to uphold it. We're here to serve the American people, not this president. We serve them before anyone. And I just know since the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 was passed, presidents of both parties have established blind trust or limited their holdings to the U.S. Treasuries, diversified mutual funds, all the assets because of conflict of interest. And you just talked about the divestment. This is the emolument clause. This is an incredibly important clause that really protects the American people. No matter who's there, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. Because it's really important to take that kind of influence out, because everyone knows being president it's a temporary gig. Because what happens afterwards, right? You have someone that is still running the Trump organization, many of them in the cabinet right now, and serving out of the White House. I am really asking for all of you to please, even if it's just for a few seconds, to talk about the emolument clause, why it's there, and why it's important to really reiterate this, because even beyond H.R. 1, this is current law now, and we're not upholding that law. We're not taking our oath that we just took 5 weeks ago seriously when we say this. And I'll tell you, I don't care if is a Democrat there, or I don't care. This is important to me that someone is making decisions based on the American people and not the best interest of a profit line or the best interest of their company, which they're going to go back after leaving that White House, go back into that. It is so critically important that we uphold the emolument clause, so I would really like for you to speak about that.
Well, the founders of our republic created a foundational document, the United States Constitution, and we've heard a lot today about the importance of that Constitution. The only conflict of interest provision that they felt they needed to include in that foundational document were the two emoluments clauses. And, frankly, I wish they'd put a whole lot more in, but those are the two they gave us, and those are the two that they felt were preeminent and needed to be in there.
Is this for every witness?
One brief second.
Well, I was just going to say that I think that the emoluments clause stands for the principle against self-dealing and using a public position to benefit yourself individually. And it's I think you can draw connections from the Ethics in Government Act and other laws that have been passed on a bipartisan basis directly to the emoluments clause and other constitutional provisions. So it's something that we think about often.
Reclaiming my time. I just want to finish this by saying that I ran for Congress, and I know many of my colleagues did, because I believed that our political system was broken, and in large part due to a complete lack of trust by our citizens in our government and in our democracy. And that restoring that trust has to be our top priority. So I have a question for all of you, and I want to make sure that Mr. Smith answers this. Do you believe that increased transparency would help restore that trust?
If you want to start with me, I would not agree with that as a blanket assertion.
You don't believe that transparency?
I think there are cases where it does, and there are cases where it does not.
Can you name one example where transparency would not restore trust in democracy?
Well, for example, I think sometimes debates of this very organization are best held in private, where you can stake out positions, give and take, without having absolutely every conversation, for example, made public. I think, for example, that if people contribute small amounts to grassroots organizations, no, the public doesn't need to know that, and the harm outweighs the benefits, the threats to people, and the fact that they often withdraw from political participation. So it's a case-by-case matter. I'm
not suggesting in any way that people need to hear every conversation. I'm saying the general mechanisms of transparency that we're asking for here in this bill.
Some of the transparency here is bad. I've outlined that in my testimony.
I'll move on to the next. Do you believe that transparency helps restore faith in democracy?
I think it's probably the most important tool we have to assure the American people that their leaders are acting in their interest.
Great. Do you all agree?
Yes. Sunlight is a good prophylactic.
Yes, and both in ethics measures and campaign finance reform measures as well.
And Mr. Smith, do you believe at least that making it easier to vote would restore trust in our democracy?
I think generally you don't want obstacles placed in the way of voting, but I don't think, again, everything making it easier to vote. For example, I would not favor having early voting begin a year before the election. So some things yes, and some
What about
no.
making it a national holiday to vote?
Making it a national holiday, I don't think that's, let's put it this way, I don't think that's a real problem or that has been shown to increase turnout or make it a whole lot easier to vote when it has been tried.
Well, I would say that for working class people who don't get paid time off, it would make it harder to try.
It may, but I don't think the empirical data shows that it has an effect there.
Okay, well, I would like to say that the former General Counsel and Acting Director of the Office of Government Ethics, Don Fox, sent a letter to the committee in support of H.R. 1. Public Citizen, the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition, and Indivisible have also written statements in support, all of which I'm adding to the record.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Amey, recognize you.
I just want to go back to the transparency, and obviously I'm a big yes. And I just want to say it's not only for the American people, but it's Congress. Earlier today we heard, I think it was Congresswoman Maloney mention that documents hadn't been turned over to Congress. We found an ethics waiver that goes back to 2003. And it was an ethics waiver for someone over at HHS, at CMS, that was working on the Medicare, Medicaid Part B portion of the health care bill. There was a gentleman there that received a waiver, and it was a general waiver, and that's why putting waivers out and making them publicly available are important. But this Congress voted on that bill and supported it, and that gentleman refused to let a member of the staff turn over information to members of Congress. And guess what? Within days, he went and worked for a lobbying shop and went to work for a company or a firm that represented the drug companies. And so it is important for the American public, but it is also important for the Senate and the House of Representatives to also have faith in the government and what information they're getting from government employees.
Thank you.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the record reflects that the President of the United States has consistently throughout his tenure donated his presidential salary back to federal agencies as recent as this last quarter. And since much of this discussion is about his private benefit by his position, I want the record to reflect that he actually donates back his salary to federal agencies. I ask unanimous consent.
If there's no objection, so ordered. I would like to close by thanking all of our witnesses again for participating today. It was helpful to hear the expertise of our witnesses and why Congress should take action on H.R. 1. H.R. 1 is a comprehensive package of reforms that we desperately need. And speaking as a recent citizen and not a member of Congress, I strongly stand in support of this and, in fact, was running on these issues long before I knew that this was coming in the form of a package. And I know that that's the case for many of my colleagues as well. The reforms in the jurisdiction of this committee would make the executive branch more accountable and transparent. I urge all members of the committee to work with us in moving this legislation forward. With that, the committee stands adjourned.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. made it a little easier, didn't it? Go ahead.